Hello friends, I am Mr. Ghost, and I am here to help you today. I know, you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, and relax. I didn't believe in ghosts. I rolled my eyes when people told me about haunted hotels or old houses full of strange noises. That changed the night I moved into the attic room of a century-old guest house. The landlady was a quiet woman with a stiff posture. She stood by the entrance, let me walk in with my suitcase, and then spoke. She handed me a small key with a worn label and said, "That room stays empty most of the time. People get uncomfortable." Her voice was flat without any obvious emotion. I shrugged and told her I didn't scare easily. That was true, at least it used to be. I climbed 3 flights of creaking stairs to reach my new room. Everything smelled like old wood and dust. The corridor was narrow, and the wallpaper was peeling in a few spots. A single bulb on the ceiling cast a weak yellow light that flickered sometimes. My room was at the far end, next to a small window that faced the street. When I opened the door, I saw a simple setup: a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. So there's also a small closet, with a slanted roof above it because we were in the attic. The air was stuffy, and I felt a slight pressure in my ears, like when a door closes in a tight room. I pushed the window open to let some air in. My first night was quiet for a while. I unpacked, took a shower, and went to bed around midnight. I'm a light sleeper, so I noticed every little groan of the wood and every distant drip of water in the pipes. At around 2:00 a.m., I heard what sounded like boots on the floor outside. They weren't fast steps. They were slow and heavy, like someone pacing back and forth. I got out of bed, slid on my shoes, and opened the door a crack. The corridor was dark except for that weak bulb near the stairs. I saw a figure at the other end. It looked like a tall man in an old-style coat and hat. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe I was half asleep. Then he turned his head in my direction. The corridor was so dim that I couldn't see his face, but I felt sure he was looking at me. I opened the door wider, ready to ask if he needed help. Suddenly, he took a step backward into the shadow and disappeared. One moment he was there. The next moment, the corridor was empty. My body tensed. The hair on my arms and neck stood up. I stood there in my doorway, heart pounding. After maybe 10 seconds of silence, I looked up and down the corridor again. Nobody. I stepped into the hallway and walked to where I had seen him. Nothing. No doors open, no squeaking floors, no sign of anyone. I felt my pulse in my ears. A fast, heavy thump. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself I was overtired. I tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. I didn't see the man again that night, and eventually I drifted off just before dawn. The next day I woke up late. I noticed an odd thing right away. The small chair by the window wasn't where I had left it. I remembered putting it against the wall before lying down, but now it was a foot away from where it had been. I figured maybe I bumped it in the dark, or maybe I misremembered. Still, something felt off. The rest of the morning was calm. I went downstairs. The landlady was in the kitchen, wiping counters. I tried to start a conversation, but she only gave short answers. She didn't ask me how I'd slept, and she didn't mention anything about footsteps or strange men. I decided not to bring it up. I left for the day and returned late in the evening. That second night I settled in to read before bed. There was one small lamp on the dresser, giving the room a weak yellow glow. Around midnight I heard a soft scraping sound. It was close, maybe in the corridor or even near my door. I listened carefully. Then I heard a quiet thump. My heart sped up. I set my book down and walked toward the door. I placed my ear against it. The hallway was silent. I grabbed the doorknob, opened it quickly, and peeked out. Nothing. I closed the door and turned around. My dresser was a few inches out of place. I remembered exactly where it had been, because I had aligned it with a mark on the floor. Now it looked crooked. I frowned, walked over, and tried to move it back. It was heavy, made of solid wood. I had to put my shoulder into it to shift it even an inch. The idea that it moved by itself didn't make sense. I checked the floor for any sign of dragging marks. Nothing obvious was present. I didn't have an explanation, and that bothered me. I stayed up late that night watching that dresser. Even as I sat on the edge of my bed, keeping the lamp on around 2:30 a.m., I heard a low murmur near my bed. It sounded like two voices whispering, but I couldn't make out words. I jumped up and spun around. I saw only the bare walls and the empty space around my bed. The murmuring faded, and I realized my throat felt dry, and that I was shaking. I rubbed my arms to steady myself, trying to locate the source, but it just seemed to come from somewhere near the foot of the bed. After a few minutes, everything went quiet again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing over me. By the third day, I felt exhausted, my eyes burned, and my head felt heavy. I went downstairs to eat breakfast, but I only managed to gulp some coffee. The landlady asked if everything was all right, and I forced a smile, saying I was fine. I didn't want to admit that something in her attic room was messing with my mind. I decided to step outside for fresh air. The building looked old from the outside too. The windows were tall, and the wooden frames were cracked. The roof was steep with a small weather vane at the top. I noticed the attic window where my room was. I got a strange feeling like I was watching myself from that window, or maybe from some other time. That night, I planned to record the sounds. I had my phone ready to capture any noise. I lay in bed, lamp off, phone in hand. Around midnight, the corridor started creaking. The footsteps were louder than before. I heard them approach my door, pause, then continue down the hall. I waited a few seconds, then opened the door and stepped out. The corridor light flickered. I saw that same figure again, standing near the stairwell. The man wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked real, not transparent or blurry. I lifted my phone to record, but by the time I raised it, the corridor light flickered again, and he was gone. I ran down the hallway to the stairs, but there was no one. I even checked the next floor down. Everything was empty. No doors closing, no footsteps. I felt a chill all over my body. The air smelled like old leather. I climbed back to my room, breathing hard. My phone video showed nothing, just a dark corridor and shaky movements. I cursed under my breath and locked my door. I sat on the bed trying to calm down. Then the lamp on the dresser turned off by itself. I froze. A second later, it turned on again. My hands started sweating. I jumped up and checked the cord. It was plugged in. I tested the switch. It worked fine. It didn't flicker when I tested it. I backed away, breathing fast. I thought about leaving right then, but my pride stopped me. I didn't want the landlady to say, "I told you so." So I stayed, although my stomach was tight and I couldn't sit still. Early the next morning, I finally managed to doze off. I slept for a few hours, then got woken up by a screeching sound. It was loud and sharp, like metal scraping on concrete. At first, I couldn't tell where it came from. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The sound echoed again, and I realized it was coming from somewhere below me, possibly the basement. I grabbed my phone and a small flashlight. I opened the door and headed downstairs. The house was dark and silent. It was around 4 a.m., so nobody else was up. I found the door to the basement half open. That door had always been closed whenever I passed it before. The light switch near the door flickered, making a buzzing noise. I shone my flashlight around the stairs leading down. The air smelled damp and stale, like old concrete and mildew. I didn't want to go down, but I had to see what was going on. Step by step, I descended. My legs were tense, and my grip on the flashlight was so tight my knuckles hurt. The basement lights flickered. The space looked cluttered, filled with old furniture and boxes stacked against the walls. I expected to see someone messing around. Nobody was there. I heard a faint rattle from behind some shelves. I walked closer. The small chain was swinging back and forth, clicking against metal. No draft, no open window, no reason for it to move. I felt a warm flush on my face from the adrenaline. My breathing was shallow. I stood there shining my flashlight around, listening to my own heartbeat. Then the overhead bulb flickered again, brighter this time, and went out. I felt a pulse of fear in my chest. I aimed my flashlight at the shelves. Nothing. I turned around and headed back up the stairs. That's when I noticed the dusty handprints on the banister. They were large and smaller, all shaped like adult hands. They overlapped each other. It looked like a crowd of people had come through, pressing their palms into the dust. But the dust was thick, and I hadn't heard a single footstep besides my own. I backed away, shining my light on each set of prints. My mind raced. I tried to figure out how so many sets of hands could appear without any noise. I reached out and touched the banister. Dust stuck to my fingertips. Nothing smeared or disturbed the prints except where I touched. I swallowed hard, pulled my hand away, and wiped it on my pants. I wanted to call the landlady, but I didn't see how that would help. I crept up the last few steps, slipped through the basement door, and shut it behind me. I locked it with a quick turn of the key. Then I stood in the hallway, catching my breath. The hallway light was on, steady, no flicker. The rest of the guest house was dark and silent. I walked back to my attic room, checking every corner on the way. My hands were shaking. I felt sweat on my forehead, and it trickled down my neck. I shut my bedroom door, locked it, and leaned against it. My ears were ringing. I paced around my room, trying to figure out if I should pack up and go. Part of me wanted to escape, while another part was stuck there like I couldn't leave yet. It was more than curiosity. It felt like I was caught between two different versions of the same place. Sometimes it seemed like I was in the present, with the old floors and flickering lights. Other times I felt like I was experiencing something from a previous era, with that man in the old clothes and the rearranging furniture. I hardly slept that morning. The sun came up, and I sat by the window staring at the street below. People walked by with their coffee cups and briefcases, oblivious to what was happening inside that building. After a while, I went downstairs to talk to the landlady. I wanted to tell her what I'd seen. She was standing by the front desk, going through some papers. Before I could speak, she said, "I know you've been hearing things." Her voice was calm, as if she was stating a fact about the weather. She didn't explain further. She just looked at me with tired eyes. I waited for more details, but she stayed quiet. I asked if she knew about the footprints or the man in the corridor. She just shook her head and said, "It's an old house. Sometimes it doesn't like new people." That's all she gave me. I went back to my room, closed the door, and tried to plan my next move. My nerves were frayed, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed, running through everything that had happened. The footsteps, the man's sudden disappearance, the moving furniture, the voices, the basement door, the dusty handprints. I felt trapped between logic and fear. My heart pounded each time I replayed those events in my head. I didn't want to stay, but I also felt drawn to find answers. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone or pacing around, but nothing calmed me down. That's where I am now, sitting in this attic room, waiting for another sign. The hallway is quiet. The landlady is downstairs. My hands are still shaking, and I keep glancing at the closet, wondering if it moves. The light bulb in here flickers sometimes, which makes me jump. I can't tell if I'm alone. This place feels like it belongs to more than one time, and I'm caught in the middle. I don't know if I'll stay much longer. But for now, I'm here, listening, waiting and hoping the next strange thing doesn't push me over the edge. I never believed in ghosts until this. Now I can't stop looking over my shoulder. I knew something was wrong from the second week I lived by the lake. Because I'm not talking about just feeling uneasy. I mean, I heard branches snapping at night, like someone was walling in circles around my property. At first, I tried to tell myself it was the wind or some animal, but it never sounded natural. The noises came in a pattern. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, and they moved around the perimeter of my yard. My heart pounded every time I heard it. I would sit straight up in bed, feel my chest tighten, and stare at the bedroom window. There was no way I was going outside in the dark to check. I told myself it could wait until morning, but even when the sun came up, I felt creeped out and tense. I had moved here because I wanted to focus on my projects without anyone bothering me. The house sits right at the edge of a calm lake surrounded by dense forest on three sides. There aren't any neighbors nearby, and I liked that. I thought I'd get a lot of work done, and I did for the first week. I woke up early, made coffee, and listened to the wind in the trees. I never heard cars or voices. It was just me, the lake, and the forest. I thought I had found perfect peace. But that feeling didn't last long. On the third day, I found odd marks in the dirt around the side of the house. At first, I saw branches and small twigs arranged in curved lines. Each cluster of branches had the same pattern. They looked like half circles, but not neat, not decorative. It was more like someone or something had dragged them across the ground. I felt a chill when I noticed they formed a rough track that led from the edge of the forest to one side of my house. I crouched down and touched one of the bent twigs. It snapped between my fingers and the sound echoed in my head. I stared at it, my mouth dry. Nobody should be out here messing around with sticks at night. I tried to ignore it. I cleaned up the broken branches and threw them deeper into the woods. But a few days later, new patterns appeared in the same spot. They were smaller that time, but the shape was similar. Again, it was like footprints circling the area, except I couldn't see any clear shoe prints, just signs that something had been walking in a loop. My arms felt prickly, and I felt a little dizzy. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the wind was blowing the branches around in a weird way. I told myself that and went back inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing those weird circles in the dirt. Around midnight, I heard that crunching outside again. It sounded like someone was walking just beyond my fence, moving slowly, stepping on sticks and leaves. I grabbed a flashlight but stayed inside. I didn't want to open the door. I stood in the hallway for at least 10 minutes, trying to gather the nerve to look through the window. My stomach felt tight and I could hear my own breathing. Finally, I took a step to the window in the living room, peeked through the blinds, and saw only darkness. Then a long howl echoed from the direction of the forest. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. I grew up hearing animal calls, and this was different. It had a strange pitch that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt my knees tremble, and I hurried away from the window. The next morning, I walked over to the lake to clear my head. The water was quiet and calm. I stood there listening to small waves lap at the shore. Then I spotted something to my left, near a clump of reeds at the water's edge. It looked like a tall shape, standing still, maybe 60 feet away. It was covered in what looked like moss or algae. It had arms that hung low and legs that seemed too long for a human. I froze and stared at it. My scalp tingled and my chest felt tight. I blinked, and the shape was gone. There was just a ripple in the water. I felt sweat on my forehead. I ran over to where I thought I saw the figure, but it wasn't there. The reeds were moving gently with the breeze. I noticed wet footprints on the muddy bank, though. They were large and elongated, but not shaped like normal feet, more like a smooth oval with no distinct toes. I felt my heartbeat hammering. I forced myself to crouch down and study them. They led away from the shore and disappeared into the undergrowth. A damp smell hit my nose, like rotting leaves in stagnant water. I followed the footprints until I reached the beginning of the dense trees. After a few steps into the forest, I lost the trail. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights on. I couldn't focus on my work. I kept thinking about the footprints. I tried to watch some old movies, but every little noise outside made me pause the movie and listen. Sometimes I heard faint rustling sounds, other times just the wind. Then, around midnight, I saw a flicker of movement through the corner of my eye. On the side window, I jumped up. My heart felt like it was in my throat. I stepped closer to the window and tried to peer out. I couldn't see anything, but the glass had a slight smudge like something pressed against it. My hand started shaking. I checked the lock on the window. Then I went around the whole house, checking every door and window. They were locked, but I still felt exposed. The next few days went by without any big incidents. But each morning I found new signs of disturbance outside. Leaves scattered in odd patterns and more branches arranged in half circles. Some nights I heard that strange howl again. Other nights I heard faint clicking sounds in the woods which reminded me of two stones tapping together. I didn't see the silhouette during the day, but sometimes I thought I glimpsed movement deep among the trees. I started leaving every light on all night, inside and outside. I installed motion sensor lights in the backyard. I thought the bright floodlight might scare off whatever was out there. But the next night, I woke up to the sound of the floodlight clicking on and off, over and over. I got out of bed, pulled on a jacket, and stepped carefully to the back door. I opened it a crack and peered outside. The floodlight switched on, lighting the entire yard. I saw the tree line in the distance. Then it went dark again. 30 seconds later, it switched on again. The yard was empty. My ears were tuned to every small sound, and I felt a pulsing in my head. I waited, feeling cold air on my face. My breath came out in shallow bursts. I took a few steps onto the porch. The motion sensor triggered once more, and the light beamed across the grass. That's when I saw it near the edge of the fence, the tall shape with moss or algae on its shoulders. It stood still facing me, but I couldn't make out any eyes. I just saw the outline of its head, which was elongated or covered in some kind of growth. Its arms were long and hung past the hips. I swallowed hard. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the fence. The creature moved so fast I barely caught the motion. It slipped behind a tree. I saw something like a slick arm or leg vanish into the darkness. My throat went dry. I took 2 more steps toward the fence, shining the flashlight around. Nothing. My skin felt hot, even though the air was cold. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I backed away into the house, locked the door, and stood there in the hallway with my back against the wall. My eyes stung from not blinking. I stood there for what felt like minutes, just listening. No more movement. When I finally went back to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The second my eyelids grew heavy, I heard that howl again, far away but loud enough to make my stomach twist. In the morning, I decided I needed to investigate the forest in daylight. I figured I'd feel safer that way. I put on sturdy boots, grabbed a long stick, and walked into the trees. It felt cool under the canopy, and I smelled damp earth. I moved slowly, pausing every few steps to listen. I heard birds calling occasionally, and sometimes I heard branches shift in the breeze, but I didn't see anything out of place at first. Then, about 20 minutes in, I found a path of flattened plants, like something large had walked through recently. The tracks led deeper into the woods. I followed them carefully, stepping around mossy logs and thick ferns. Eventually, I came upon a small clearing where the ground was muddy. I saw footprints similar to the ones by the lake. They were bigger than a human foot, more oval-shaped, and they were spaced like something had taken long strides. A rotten smell lingered in the air, like decaying leaves mixed with pond scum. My nose wrinkled. I bent down, pressing my hand against one of the prints. The mud was still slightly wet. My pulse sped up. I stood up straight and looked around. The clearing was quiet. No wind, no birds, no movement. My scalp felt prickly. I backed away slowly and left the clearing. I didn't want to see that creature. Not here, not alone. The next few evenings, I kept all the blinds shut and the lights on. Each night, I heard more strange sounds. Branches snapping, that creepy howl, and once a series of clicks that seemed to circle the house. My chest felt tight most of the time, and I found it hard to focus on anything but my growing fear. I called a friend to talk about it, but I didn't give him the full story. I just said I had weird noises at night. He told me it was probably just raccoons or deer. I didn't correct him. I knew he wouldn't believe the rest of it. One night, around 10 o'clock, I decided to take a quick look outside before going to bed. I felt restless and on edge, so I wanted to reassure myself that everything was calm. I opened my front door and stepped onto the porch. I had my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. I scanned the yard. Everything looked still. The porch light cast a circle of yellow onto the grass, and the rest of the property was dark. I started walking toward the lake to see if anything was near the water. I kept my steps quiet, one foot in front of the other. The air was cold, and my breath formed small clouds. Halfway to the shore, I heard a low clicking sound from somewhere to my left. My legs stiffened, my stomach churned. I shone my flashlight in that direction. I saw a tall shape dart behind a large tree trunk. My flashlight's beam caught a brief glimpse of wet greenish material. I felt blood rush to my ears, and my pulse throb. I backed up slowly, shining the light in front of me. I didn't want to turn my back on it. The clicking grew louder, echoing between the trees. My teeth clenched, while I kept moving backwards step by step until I reached the porch. Inside, I locked the door. My hands shook, and my breath came in short bursts. My chest felt tight and my throat seemed constricted. I rushed around the house, double-checking every window lock. Then I sat in my living room with all the lights on, gripping the flashlight. My legs felt weak, and my arms twitched whenever I heard the wind rattle the walls. I stayed up the entire night, listening for any sound outside. The motion sensor lights flickered on and off a few times, but I didn't get up to check. Now, every evening, I feel my muscles tense up after sunset. I start sweating, and my mind races with the possibility of seeing that shape again. I haven't had an actual confrontation with it, but I sense it's watching. I sense it's studying me, like a predator studies possible prey. When I walk around my own house, I feel a cold drop in the pit of my stomach. I keep my phone in my hand, ready to call for help, but I have no idea what I'd say if someone answered. There's a tall, moss-covered creature circling my property. That doesn't sound believable. I still can't decide if I should leave. Part of me wants to pack up and never come back, but another part of me believes that I can't leave unless I understand what's going on. Every night is harder though. I sleep with the bedroom lamp on, plus a floor lamp in the corner. I keep the hallway light on too. If I wake up and see any dark shape in the doorway, I want to know immediately. I feel safer with the lights, even though they don't really protect me. Every day, I check around the house for footprints. Most days, I find that they're always near the edges of the property, usually in mud or patches of loose dirt. I follow them until they vanish into the forest. Sometimes I find long scratches on the bark of trees, like something with long nails or claws dragged them across the wood. I touch the marks, feeling the grooves under my fingertips. My breath shakes, my heartbeat picks up. I look around expecting to see that shape standing behind me. Sometimes I think I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn, there's nothing. I can't deny what's happening. It's real. I see the evidence, and I feel it in the tightness of my throat at night. I don't know what this creature wants. I don't know how to make it go away. All I can do is keep the lights on, check my locks, and wait for sunrise. But deep down, I sense it's only a matter of time before it comes closer. Every evening I look out my window and I wonder if that's the night it decides to step into the yard, or onto the porch, or even try the door. That thought hits me in the gut and makes me feel like I'm seconds away from panic. Right now, I'm in my living room with all the lights on. I'm writing this down because it's the only thing that keeps me steady. Outside, the wind is picking up. The motion sensor light flickers from time to time, and I hear branches rustling. I keep my eyes on the windows. My mouth is dry, and I'm swallowing hard. My fingertips feel cold. In waiting for that shape to appear somewhere out there. I can see it yet, but I feel like it's there, maybe behind a tree or crouched under the deck, listening to my every movement. I can stop thinking about the next time I step outside in the dark, because I have a feeling it'll be waiting, and I don't know how long I can keep this up. I got the call on a Thursday afternoon. Some lawyer with a flat voice told me I had inherited a mansion from an uncle I never knew. I felt strange hearing this, like someone was joking around. He explained the conditions. I had to live there for a year or I'd lose the inheritance. That was the only catch. At first I shrugged it off. A house is a house, especially one that's supposed to be huge and valuable. I figured I could handle a year. I thought I'd make use of the place, maybe fix it up, and then decide if I wanted to sell it. I had no clue what I was walking into. When I drove up the narrow road that led to the gate, I saw tall hedges on both sides. The sky was clouded over, and the air smelled like damp leaves. My car rattled on loose gravel. I got out in front of the old iron gates, which squeaked when I pushed them. Beyond the gates, there's a winding driveway lined with dead grass and patches of weeds. At the end of that driveway stood a huge 3-story mansion. Its stone walls looked worn and a little grimy. The windows were tall and narrow, most covered by heavy shutters. I walked closer, listening to the crunch of gravel under my shoes. My shoulders felt tense. When I finally reached the front door, I noticed the oversized door knocker shaped like a lion's head. It was cold and heavy to the touch. I pushed the door open, and it made a creaking noise. Dust swirled in the dim hallway. I could smell old wood and stale air. The place felt abandoned, but there were signs that someone had been inside recently. Maybe the lawyer's people or caretakers. There was a large staircase to my right, with a worn-out carpet runner. I could see a long corridor to my left, and several doors straight ahead. I remember my heart pounding a bit from the excitement of exploring a new property. At that moment, I felt okay. I had no reason to suspect what was waiting for me on the other side of those mirrors. I dropped my duffel bag by the staircase. My plan was to check each room and figure out which one I wanted to use as my bedroom. I walked down the corridor, opening doors along the way. Most rooms were empty or had old furniture covered with cloth. One door led to a study with a large dusty desk and shelves filled with thick books. The floor in there squeaked under my weight. I sneezed a few times from the dust. Another door opened to a drawing room with high ceilings and heavy drapes. The musty smell made my nose wrinkle. That was when I noticed the first mirror. It was tall, with an ornate frame, and the glass looked clean, which was odd since everything else in that room was coated with dust. I glanced at my reflection. I saw my eyes darting around and I noticed my hair was a bit messy from the drive. I wiped some sweat from my forehead and moved on. I found a small kitchen at the back of the mansion which had outdated appliances and worn countertops. A single light bulb flickered when I turned on the switch. I tried the faucet. The pipes shook, and water sputtered out in bursts. I guessed no one had run the water here in a while. There was a back door that opened onto a courtyard filled with dried plants and a discolored fountain. I looked around for a few minutes, then made my way upstairs to see the bedrooms. On the second floor, I noticed a long hallway with several doors on each side. Each door had a Rhines knob that felt cold in my hand. I picked one room near the end of the hallway. Inside, I saw a large bed frame, no mattress, a wooden dresser, and another tall mirror. Its frame matched the one I'd seen downstairs. The glass was spotless, reflecting the entire room in perfect detail. I stepped in front of it. I could see my tired eyes and my slouched posture. My left shoulder felt stiff from lugging my bag, so I rolled it a bit to loosen it up. I noticed something in the mirror's reflection. The door behind me was halfway open, but I had left it fully open when I walked in. I glanced back. The door was indeed halfway open now. I felt a chill on my neck. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe the door's hinges were uneven. I decided to settle in that room and so placed my bag on the floor by the dresser. The air felt heavy, so I opened a window, letting in a bit of the afternoon breeze. The smell of old carpet hung around. I rummaged through my bag to grab a fresh t-shirt. I noticed my phone's battery was low. I walked around looking for an outlet. The mansion's wiring felt outdated, and several outlets didn't look safe. I finally found one that seemed functional and plugged in my charger. That first night, I mostly explored the house. I discovered multiple rooms with giant mirrors of the same style, ornate frames, spotless glass. I wondered why my uncle was so obsessed with these mirrors. Maybe he was a collector. I walked around the creaky floors flipping on lights. Most bulbs worked, though they were all dim. I couldn't shake the odd feeling that the mirrors didn't quite match their surroundings. They were too clean and well maintained. I'd look into them and see my reflection staring back, but something in my gut felt unsettled. Around midnight, I went back to my room. I felt exhausted. I locked the door and tried to sleep. It was quiet except for the occasional groan of the old pipes. I slipped into a light sleep, but around 2 a.m. I woke up with my heart racing. I had no idea why. I sat up, my shirt damp with sweat. The mirror in the room caught my eye. It was so dark, yet the glass seemed to glow a little. I got up and approached it. My reflection was there, but I looked pale. My face seemed drawn. Then I noticed something else in the reflection. The door behind me was open again. I swung around. The door was wide open, but I remembered locking it before going to bed. My entire body felt rigid, and my neck tingled with fear. I walked to the doorway and saw the dark hallway outside. I didn't see anyone. My hands shook a bit as I shut the door and locked it again. I stayed up for a while before dozing off in an uneasy sleep. The next morning I found footprints in the dust on the hallway floor outside my room. They looked fresh. I placed my own shoe next to them. They were the same size as mine. I felt a tightness in my chest. I told myself maybe I had walked there the night before, half asleep. I didn't like how that logic didn't quite make sense. It was still early, so I went downstairs for coffee. The kitchen smelled stale. I found an old kettle and tried to heat water on the stove. The burners took a few tries to ignite. Eventually, I had a hot cup of instant coffee. It tasted bitter. I leaned against the counter trying to calm my nerves. After breakfast, I decided to clean up the study. I wanted a functional workspace. I felt I might do some remote real estate work from here. That's my profession, and I don't like being idle. I opened the curtains to let some light in. Dust motes floated in the air. The old desk was massive, made of dark wood. I grabbed a rag and started wiping it down. Then I spotted another mirror, smaller this time, propped against a wall near the bookshelves. I picked it up to move it. As I lifted it, I caught a glimpse of myself. I froze. I saw my own face, but I had a fresh scratch on my cheek. I touched my cheek, but there was no scratch there. I thought my mind was playing tricks. Then, in the reflection, I saw myself trip on a loose floorboard and fall into the bookshelf behind me. It happened quickly in the reflection, and the books toppled. I felt a jolt of panic. I turned around in real life to check the floor, but it was fine. I placed the mirror carefully against a chair and backed away. For the rest of the morning, I avoided that mirror. But a few hours later, I forgot about the reflection. I was busy dusting the bookshelves and stepped on a loose board. My foot caught on it, and I fell forward, banging my shoulder into the shelf. Books tumbled down. One of them smacked my arm hard. I gasped from the sharp pain. I sat there, feeling a dull ache spread through my shoulder. That matched exactly what I'd seen in the mirror's reflection. My heart thumped so hard that my chest felt tight. I stayed on the floor for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. Sweat formed on my forehead, and I felt a wave of nausea. I spent the next few days learning the mansion's layout and trying not to stare at any mirrors. I noticed that each mirror showed something disturbing that would happen in the near future. It never showed anything pleasant. Sometimes it would be a small accident, like dropping a plate or burning my hand on the stove. Other times it would be something more unsettling, like catching a glimpse of a stranger standing behind me in the hallway. I felt my sanity slipping, but I couldn't leave. The deal required me to stay here. I tried to outsmart these visions. Whenever I saw something in the mirror, I'd try to do the opposite. For instance, if the mirror showed me slipping on wet tiles in the bathroom, I'd avoid the bathroom entirely that day, but then I'd find myself needing to use it anyway. Or a pipe would burst near the kitchen, forcing me to fetch old towels from the bathroom. Eventually, I'd slip on a wet spot I hadn't seen. No matter what I did, the vision came true. One afternoon, the mirror in the second-floor corridor showed me stumbling on the stairs and twisting my ankle. I thought I'd be clever and stay upstairs all day. I had enough food in a mini fridge I had set up in my room. But later that evening, the power flickered. The hallway light popped. I needed to go down to the fuse box in the basement. I tried using a different staircase at the other end of the corridor, convinced it would help me avoid the predicted accident. But that staircase had a broken step. I didn't know that. When I placed my foot on it, the board gave way, and I nearly fell. I twisted my ankle trying to catch myself. I sat there, gripping the banister, breathing fast. Director. My ankle throbbed. My eyes stung with tears of anger and pain. I pushed myself up, wincing with each step, and limped back to my room. I tried to ignore the stale air and musty smell. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I started covering mirrors with sheets. It made me feel less anxious. For a while, I thought it was working. I didn't have to look at those awful reflections. But then, late one night, I heard something clang in the corridor. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out of my room. One of the sheets had been pulled off, and the mirror underneath was angled toward the stairs. I lifted the flashlight to see what it was reflecting. I saw myself in the beam of light. My face looked terrified. In the reflection, a framed painting fell off the wall and shattered on the floor near my feet. I backed away, thinking if I stayed clear, nothing would happen. At that second, I heard a crack from above. The painting's hook gave way, and the frame hit the ground just inches from me. Glass scattered across the floor. I jumped back, my heart pounding like it was about to burst. My flashlight shook in my hands. Every day felt like a battle against these predictions. They weren't huge disasters, but they kept me in a constant state of dread. My body was tense all the time, my shoulders ached, my neck felt stiff, and I had headaches that lasted for hours. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me sit up in bed. The mirrors weren't just showing me random things. They seemed to want me to see these terrible moments, like the house thrived on my fear. I thought about leaving, but I remembered the inheritance. I also feared that maybe leaving wouldn't help. Maybe these visions would follow me. I had no idea if they were tied to the house or to me. That uncertainty felt like a heavy weight in my stomach. One evening, I considered smashing the mirrors. I took a hammer from the toolbox in the storage room. My hands trembled as I carried it upstairs. I went to the big mirror in my bedroom. I raised the hammer, but I hesitated. Something told me this could make things worse. I also worried about shards of glass flying all over. My body was shaking. I lowered the hammer. I didn't want to see what might happen if I broke that mirror. I felt trapped by the possibilities. I set the hammer down, my palms clammy. I decided to ignore the visions as best as I could. When I happened to see one, I just accepted. If I saw myself spilling coffee, I'd let it happen. If I saw a cabinet door slamming on my fingers, I'd brace myself for the pain. I thought I could manage, but each time I surrendered to these predictions, they got worse. The accidents became more frequent. One day, I tripped over a loose rug and crashed into a side table, bruising my hip. Another day, I burned my arm on a radiator that I thought was turned off. My limbs were covered in scrapes and bruises. I felt like the house wanted to wear me down until I broke. I tried locking some mirrors in a storage room, but I'd find them outside again, propped against walls or placed on furniture. It made no sense. Doors I knew I had locked would be unlocked. The house was playing tricks on me, or I was losing track of what I was doing. My appetite vanished. I survived on quick snacks and water. My throat felt scratchy from dust. My eyes stung from lack of proper sleep. I stopped calling my friends because I wasn't sure how to explain any of this. Whenever I looked at my phone, I saw missed calls from people at work, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about my situation. Weeks passed. I told myself I just had to last 1 year. I started marking days on a calendar. My main focus was staying safe and dealing with these mirrors day by day. I roamed the house with a flashlight after dark. I placed wooden boards over some windows because I felt exposed at night. I kept my phone handy, though I had poor reception in certain rooms. The days blurred together. My legs felt weak from walking around in constant vigilance. My eyelids stayed heavy from lack of proper rest. Every time I saw a new reflection, the worst part was feeling helpless. One morning, while brushing my teeth, I glimpsed a small mirror on the counter. It showed me dropping my toothbrush and splattering toothpaste on my shirt. That was minor, but it shook me because it was so mundane. That's when I realized it didn't matter how big or small the event was. This place was determined to show me anything unpleasant, and then force me to live it. It was a slow, grinding torment. Now, after weeks of this, I'm still here. My ankle is healed, but it still aches occasionally. My shoulder hurts when I lift heavy objects. I have gotten better at predicting how these small disasters will occur, but it hasn't given me much relief. Each day, I wake up tense. Each night I go to bed with my nerves on edge. I've stopped trying to change the future. In just waiting out the year, sometimes I catch myself staring at the calendar, counting the days. I get waves of dread in my gut when I realize how many months remain. I hold on to the hope that once I'm free of this house, the mirrors will leave me alone. I have no idea what my uncle was doing here, or why he left it to me under these conditions. The lawyer never returned my calls after handing over the keys. My voicemails to him went unanswered.
I feel like I'm stuck in a loop.
The mirrors keep showing me awful moments, and I keep failing to avoid them. I've resigned myself to the bruises, the twisted ankles, the cuts, and the fear that seeps into my bones every time I open my eyes. So right now, I'm focused on surviving this place for a few more months. When the year is up, I'll make my choice. Sell the mansion or burn it to the ground. I just need to get out of here in one piece. That's all I'm focused on. I'm doing everything I can to make sure these predictions don't break me. I'm still standing, and for now that's enough. I walked into the auction house with a tight feeling in my stomach. I wanted a new instrument, but I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. I saw a few battered violins on a long table. Most of them looked like they needed serious repairs. Then I noticed one violin in the far corner. It had deep scratches on the back and a strange glow under the light. It wasn't shiny or fancy. It looked dark and dull, like it had been stuck in an attic for decades. For some reason, my eyes locked on it. I raised my hand at the final call, paid way more than I intended, and walked out with that old violin in my case. After I got home, I placed the violin on my desk. It smelled like musty wood and rosin, more intense than other violins I'd played. The varnish had cracks, and the neck looked slightly warped. I decided to tune it and see if the strings could still hold pitch. I tightened each peg with slow, steady movements. The strings groaned and creaked, but eventually I managed to get something close to correct tuning. I drew my bow across the G string. The sound was raspy and rough, but it had an odd resonance. It echoed in my living room and made me pause. I tried a few scales going up and down, checking the tone. The notes sounded hollow, but also strong. It's hard to explain. I'm not trying to be fancy about it. It just sounded different from any other violin I'd played. I felt a little shiver in my arms. I practiced for about an hour that night. My shoulders started to ache because I was tense, and my heart beat faster than usual. I took a break, put the violin in its case, and decided to sleep early. But that night, I tossed and turned for hours, waking up several times in a sweat, but brushing it off as stress from spending too much on an old instrument. The next evening, I set up a music stand in my living room and placed some sheet music on it. I wanted to test the violin more thoroughly. I started with a simple piece. The notes rang out with strange clarity. I heard a faint echo after each phrase, even though I was in a small apartment. I wondered if maybe the violin's wood had some unique acoustic property. I kept playing, focusing on my bow strokes and intonation. Then I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I stopped playing and looked around, but nothing was there. I shrugged and continued the piece. About halfway through, I saw something again, like a brief flicker. I put the violin down and felt my chest tighten. My breathing turned shallow. I looked around each corner of the room. The lamp on the table flickered. My hands got clammy. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt a presence, like someone was standing just behind me. I forced myself to keep playing, but I changed pieces. I picked a more upbeat tune, something to calm my nerves. I was about a minute in when I saw a pale figure near the kitchen door. It looked like an outline of a person, but it was faint and colorless. My bow trembled against the string. The note came out cracked and uncertain. Then the figure vanished. I put the violin down immediately, my heart pounding. I walked over to the kitchen door. My hands were shaking. I flipped on every light in the apartment, checking every room. I was alone. I went back to the living room, stood there, and stared at the violin. My throat felt dry. My mind was racing with questions. Wasn't I seeing things? Maybe it was the lighting in my apartment, or maybe I was exhausted. I decided to take a shower and watch some TV to clear my head. The next day, I woke up feeling uneasy. I had to go to a rehearsal with a small ensemble, but I decided not to bring the old violin. I grabbed my regular instrument and left for the rehearsal space downtown. The practice went fine, but the entire time I couldn't stop thinking about that faint figure. I kept picturing that outline near my kitchen door. I wondered if there was something about that old violin causing me to hallucinate. After we wrapped up, I rushed home to check on it. When I got back, everything was still in place. I took the old violin out of its case and held it in my hands. I felt that same tingle in my arms. I decided to play a few notes. I wanted to see if I could recreate that strange vision or feeling. I ran the bow across the strings. The sound was warm but eerie. I played the same piece where I first saw the figure. When I got to the tricky part, the room got cold. My breath felt shallow. I heard the faint sound of whispering, but I couldn't make out any words. Then I saw several shapes at once scattered around the room. They were all translucent, moving in slow circles. I kept playing because I was too stunned to stop. They danced around me, gliding across the floor. They didn't speak. They just swayed and turned, matching the rhythm of the music. My heart pounded so hard that I thought I might pass out. I saw their faces, but they had no specific features. They looked like faint outlines, but with slight differences in size and height. I stopped playing abruptly. They vanished. I stood there, breathing fast, staring at the empty space. I realized the violin was causing these apparitions to appear. I felt sweat dripping down the back of my neck. My t-shirt stuck to my skin. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was curious and part of me was terrified. I decided to play another short tune, just a simple melody I knew by heart. As soon as the notes filled the air, the shapes returned. They danced again, but this time I could hear a low hum coming from them like a distant wind. I stopped after a minute. They disappeared again. My body felt shaky. I sat down on my couch, set the violin aside, and tried to steady my breathing. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my forehead felt slick with sweat. I realized I was dealing with something I couldn't explain in normal terms. But there it was, plain as day. Every time I played, these ghostly figures appeared, and they seemed to want me to keep going. That night, I slept even worse. I woke up several times, convinced I heard the violin playing by itself in the other room. I'd rush in and find it silent and still. At around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted off, only to dream of shadows circling around me. When the alarm went off, I felt completely drained. Over the next week, the apparitions returned every time I practiced with the old violin. The figures would swirl around the living room. At first, they stuck to the corners, but after a few days, they started getting closer. They came right up next to me, as if they were studying the movement of my bow or listening to the vibrations. I felt a cold chill whenever they got close. My arms would break out in goosebumps, my hair would stand on end, my pulse would spike, and my breathing would speed up. But I kept playing because I couldn't seem to stop. It was like the violin demanded it. Then I started to hear voices. It happened on a rainy afternoon. I was practicing a slow haunting piece. I saw the ghosts appear, forming a circle around me. As I moved into the final section, I heard them whispering. It wasn't in a language I recognized. It sounded harsh and urgent. The whispers filled my ears, and I almost dropped my bow. I stopped playing, and they vanished, leaving me alone in my silent apartment. Later that night, I tried playing something more cheerful. The ghosts showed up again, but this time their movements looked abrupt and agitated. The whispers turned into sharp moans. I felt panic building in my chest, so I stopped. I put the violin down and backed away. That's when I heard a voice, loud and clear in my head, telling me to play a specific melody. I don't know how I understood it, but I did. It was as if the violin forced the instruction straight into my brain. I attempted to play what I heard in my head, but it didn't match any song I knew. The pattern of notes was strange and dissonant. My fingers stumbled on the fingerboard and my bow squeaked. The ghosts flickered in and out like static on an old TV. I tried again, pushing my fingers into positions that felt uncomfortable. It sounded like random chaos. My shoulder tensed up, and my wrist began to cramp. I kept going, but I couldn't sustain it. My arms felt like lead. I finally stopped when my forearms started to twitch from strain. The ghosts vanished, and I collapsed onto my couch, breathing hard. Over the next few days, I couldn't get that weird sequence out of my head. Every time I picked up the violin, I heard that urgent voice telling me to continue that impossible melody. I tried to write it down, but the notes didn't fit any scale. There were huge leaps and awkward intervals. I practiced for hours, ignoring phone calls and missing meals. My body felt stiff, my eyes burned, and my back ached. But the ghosts kept appearing, demanding more. They got more intense each time. I'd see them crowding around me, forming a tight ring. My living room felt suffocating. It smelled stale, like old fabric and damp walls. The air felt thick, making it hard to breathe. Sometimes I'd look at my clock and realize I'd been trying to play that insane piece for 6 hours straight. My fingers were raw and my shoulders cramped. Whenever I stopped, the ghosts would fade, but I felt their presence lingering, like a cold draft. One afternoon, I lost my grip on the bow. It clattered to the floor. My chest was heaving, and my ears were ringing. I looked up and saw dozens of those shapes pressing in on me. I tried to grab my bow, but my hand was shaking so badly that I dropped it again. My knees felt weak, and I almost fell over. I crawled toward the bow, grabbed it, and started playing the easiest scale I could think of. The ghosts drifted back a little, but they didn't leave. I reached a point where I couldn't handle it anymore. My fingers were swollen, and I had a rash on my neck from the violin rubbing against my skin. I also hadn't been sleeping well. Every night I'd jolt awake, hearing that same voice telling me to play. My bed felt cold and unwelcoming. My curtains would shift in a breeze. I couldn't explain. The overhead light in my bedroom would flicker at odd intervals. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt. I had dark circles under my eyes and pale skin. I decided to pack the violin away and ignore it for a while, so I stored it in my closet behind some old jackets. For a day or two, things were quiet, but on the third day I heard a faint scratching noise from the closet. It was soft at first, like fabric rustling. Then it grew louder, like something was scraping the inside of the violin case. I checked the closet, but everything looked normal. Still, the noise persisted every few hours. I felt a constant tension in my chest, as if I were waiting for something bad to happen. After a week of this, I gave in and took the violin out again. As soon as I touched it, my hands tingled and the air felt cold around me. I tried playing a simple tune. The ghosts appeared, looking a bit more solid than before, though they were still transparent. Their faces were almost visible, with hints of eye sockets and faint outlines of mouths. I played for a few minutes and then that voice returned, commanding me to play that complicated sequence. I tried again, forcing my fingers into positions that seemed unnatural. My wrist started to ache, but I kept going, determined to see if I could satisfy whatever these entities wanted. The notes sounded bizarre and unsettling. My bow felt too heavy. My arms trembled. I got through maybe half of the sequence before my muscles gave out. My bow hand slipped, and I let out a cry of frustration. A sharp vibration echoed through the room, and all the ghosts rushed at me. I felt a chill sweep through my body like a sudden blast of cold air. My vision blurred. My heart pounded so hard that my chest hurt. My thoughts raced. I didn't think about why this was happening or if I was cursed. I just thought about getting out of that room. I stumbled backward, dropped the violin on the couch, and ran to the bathroom. I slammed the door and locked it. I pressed my back against the tiles, breathing like I just sprinted a mile. I stayed in there for at least 15 minutes. I didn't hear anything, but I felt a tightness in my ribs. I finally emerged, half expecting the ghosts to be waiting for me. But the living room was empty. The violin rested on the couch, silent. I decided I needed to find a way to stop this. I couldn't destroy the violin because I was afraid of how they might react. I also didn't want to sell it and burden someone else with this problem. So I wrapped it in a thick cloth, placed it in its case, and shoved the case under my bed. Every night I hear faint knocks and whispers from beneath me, but I do my best to ignore them. I sleep with the lights on now. My nerves are always on edge, and I still wake up with that strange melody in my head. I haven't touched the violin in a few days, but I can't help thinking about it. My hands still feel the positions of those impossible chords. My ears ring with the memory of those whispers. Sometimes I see a flicker in my peripheral vision, like a ghost waiting to be let in. I try to resist, but part of me feels drawn to that old violin. Part of me wants to finish that sequence and see what happens, while another part is terrified of what might appear if I do. For now, I'm caught in this tense quiet. The violin stays hidden. The ghosts seem dormant, but I can sense them whenever I'm alone. My entire body stays on alert, like I'm ready to run. I've told a few friends that I've been busy, that I'm not feeling well. I can't explain any of this to them. It sounds ridiculous if I say it out loud, so I keep it to myself. I sit here feeling my pulse throb in my temples, wondering when the ghosts will come back to demand that I pick up the bow and play that impossible music. I don't know if I can resist forever, but for now that's all I can do. I wait, hoping they'll forget about me, even though I doubt they ever will. The old violin is quiet under my bed, but I feel its pull every time the apartment goes silent. My heart races at the thought of it. The ghosts might be patient or they might be biding their time, but I know they're still out there, waiting for the next note. And that's the story I have right now. It's raw, real, and I'm still living it. I remember the exact moment I noticed her for the first time. I was sitting at my desk late at night, scrolling through shots I'd taken earlier that day. My eyes kept drifting to a faint figure in the corner of one image. It looked like a woman in a white dress standing in the background. At first I thought it was just some random bystander I hadn't noticed while I was shooting. But something about her posture caught my attention. She was facing me. It felt odd. It made my stomach tighten a bit, the way you feel when someone's staring at you in a crowd. My name is Rick Martinez. I'm a freelance photographer who specializes in ancient architecture. I travel around, mostly in old towns, cathedrals, abandoned convents, or any place that might have some historic or atmospheric interest. I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily. My job takes me to strange places, often at odd hours. I've gotten used to dark corridors, locked gates, and the echo of my own footsteps and quiet ruins. But that night, as I zoomed in to see if I could get a clearer look at that woman, something clicked in my gut. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I swear I could feel her gaze right through the screen. I tried to brush it off and moved on to the next shot. A few minutes later, I stumbled on a second shot from a different angle of the same building. The woman appeared again, this time in a different position. She was on the far left side of the frame, still in white, but I only caught the silhouette of her shoulder and part of her hair. It didn't make sense because I took these pictures in quick succession, and I never saw anyone walking around me. The next day, I went to the same site. It was an old convent with tall walls and a worn courtyard. I wanted better lighting, so I arrived around noon. The place felt quiet. I set up my tripod and started shooting the arches along one side of the courtyard. The wind kicked up some dust now and then, but otherwise it was dead silent. As I worked, I felt this mild pressure in my chest, like I was on edge without knowing why. I tried to ignore it. When I got home, I skimmed through the new batch of photos. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then, near the end of the set, I found her again. I leaned closer to my monitor. She was standing behind one of the columns. I froze. My breathing got shallow. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. This wasn't a coincidence. She was definitely there, wearing the same white dress. She looked a little closer this time, like she'd moved maybe a few feet in my direction. I felt my palms sweat. My heart raced. I started telling myself it could be a local woman or some curious passerby, but I never saw her in person, and I tend to notice people in my shot, because it's my job to frame scenes carefully. I didn't remember seeing anyone. I tried to dismiss it as a strange coincidence. Maybe I was missing something obvious, like an employee who worked there, or a visitor who happened to cross paths with me. That night, I barely slept. I tossed around in bed, thinking about the images. I decided I'd do a careful check the next day, image by image, to see if there was any pattern. I thought I might uncover some glitch or reflection or something that would explain her presence. When morning came, I opened my editing software and went through all my recent shoots. I found 6 pictures featuring the woman in white. In every shot, she stood in a different spot, sometimes partially hidden, sometimes more in the open. But each time she appeared a bit closer to where I'd been standing. I started to notice details. Her dress looked vintage, loose around the arms and reaching down to her ankles. Her hair was dark, maybe black or deep brown, but I couldn't get a clear look at her face. Over the next few days, I had other gigs scheduled, mostly in nearby villages. One shoot took me to an old library building, another was at a small church with stained glass windows. I felt twitchy, always looking over my shoulder. I kept waiting for her to show up. Sometimes I had trouble focusing on my work because I was scanning corners and doorways. My mind felt stuck on high alert, like a muscle that wouldn't relax. But I didn't see anyone suspicious in real time. No one approached me. Yet every evening I'd upload my photos, and there she was, always in white, always placed somewhere in the background. She kept inching closer. Sometimes I'd see her figure just behind a row of pews. Sometimes she was leaning against a wall. One time she appeared near a narrow doorway that led to a staircase. She was about halfway up the stairs, staring down at me. I got chills. I could practically feel her breath. I started locking my apartment door more carefully. It might sound stupid, but I started glancing through the peephole before I left. My mind played tricks on me, so I made sure to check behind me while I walked in the hallway. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I figured they'd think I was imagining things or messing around. Plus, I couldn't even explain it. There was no logical reason for the same woman in a white dress to show up in every set of photos I took, especially in places she had no reason to be. One day, I had a shoot at an old fortress on the outskirts of the city. It was surrounded by a dry moat and had high stone walls. I arrived around 4 p.m., hoping the light would be good for capturing the building's texture. I tried to focus on my job. I shot the outer walls, the large gate, and parts of the courtyard. The place was almost deserted. There were just a few tourists in the distance taking selfies. At one point, I felt a wave of unease. My shoulders tensed. I heard a faint sound, maybe shoes scraping on gravel. I spun around, my heart pounding. Nobody was there. I let out a shaky exhale and got back to work. After a few hours, I packed up and headed home. My hands felt cold on the steering wheel. My legs felt uneasy, like I'd been bracing for something all day. When I got back to my apartment, I hurried inside and locked the door. I tossed my keys onto the table, put my camera bag down and sat at my desk. I wanted to get it over with. I wanted to see the photos, but at the same time I dreaded finding her again. I imported the shots. The first 30 or so were normal. I felt a small flicker of relief, thinking maybe she wasn't there this time. Then, in the 31st image, I saw her. I leaned in, feeling my stomach twist. She was near a doorway in the wall, half hidden but very clear. The next few photos showed her in the courtyard, behind the wide arch. In the last photo, she was front and center, still several feet away, but unmistakably closer than before. I felt something tighten in my chest. My breathing grew fast. My fingers shook on the mouse. I started thinking about quitting photography for a while or changing my specialty, but this is my livelihood. I've never done anything else. I tried to tell myself this was some weird coincidence or a bizarre prank, but I couldn't figure out how anyone would pull it off, especially in so many different locations. The next few days, I avoided going out. I stayed in my apartment, scanning the internet for any clue about a woman who might wander around old sites in a white dress. I found nothing. I double-checked local forums, asking vague questions like, "Has anyone seen a woman in white around old buildings?" Nobody answered with anything helpful. Finally, after days of pacing around my living room, I accepted another job. A small local historical society asked me to photograph the interior of an old bell tower in the center of town. I needed the money. Plus, I thought maybe I'd be able to see her directly if she showed up again. I wanted to confront her or at least figure out how she was doing this. The tower was about 90 feet tall, with narrow stairs winding all the way up. The inside smelled like damp stone and rusted metal. The air felt heavy. My footsteps echoed as I climbed the steps. I heard pigeons fluttering somewhere above me. I set up my camera near the base, aimed at the spiral staircase that led to the bell. I fired off a few shots, adjusting my flash to account for the dim light. The sound of the shutter bounced off the walls. My breath sounded loud in the enclosed space. After a few minutes, I moved up to the next landing. I took more shots of the old stone walls. The smell of dust and mildew made me cough a couple of times. Somewhere between the second and third landings, I felt a sudden rush of cold air. I froze and held my breath, listening. My skin prickled like static. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise. Then I heard a faint footstep above me. It sounded like a soft tap on the stone. My heart jumped into my throat. I pointed my flashlight up the stairwell. I didn't see anyone, but I thought I caught a slight movement, like a white flicker disappearing around the next curve of the stairs. A surge of adrenaline hit me. My legs felt weak. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I forced myself to climb the stairs, step by step. My muscles were tense. My breathing came in short bursts. The higher I climbed, the darker it felt, even though there were small openings in the walls. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. When I reached the top, I saw the huge bell overhead, covered in rust. The floor up there was rough stone. There was nowhere to hide except behind a couple of wooden beams and some old debris. I scanned every corner. I saw some spider webs and a few dead leaves, but no one in white. The place felt dead quiet. I realized my back was covered in sweat. I stayed there for a few minutes, heart thumping. Then I made my way down. My legs felt shaky on the descent. I finished taking a few wide shots on each landing just to complete the job, but I was rushing. Back home, I started reviewing the pictures. My mouth felt dry. My shirt stuck to my skin. I clicked through shot after shot. Then, in one frame near the top of the tower, I spotted her face. She was behind me, or at least behind the camera's perspective. I saw half her face peeking out from behind one of the beams, staring straight at the lens. She looked close, maybe only a few feet away. Her eyes appeared dark, and her skin looked pale under the harsh flash. I gasped and felt my heart slam in my chest. I didn't remember seeing anyone when I stood there. Yet, there she was. My entire body went rigid. I spent that night barricaded in my apartment. I had no appetite. I drank water and paced. My mind replayed every detail. I felt jittery, like my nerves were on fire. Whenever I passed a mirror, I glanced into it, half expecting to see her. I kept the TV on for noise. Eventually, I collapsed onto the couch and dozed off, but my sleep was restless. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. I decided I needed a break from shooting. I had some editing jobs to finish, but I didn't want to set foot outside. I made coffee, sat at my computer, and tried to focus on retouching a client's photos. But every time I opened a file, I found myself checking the background for a hint of a white dress. My heart would pound, and my breathing would hitch. I kept expecting to see her. I started thinking about how she kept appearing closer in each shot. I felt certain that if I kept taking photos, she'd eventually be right in front of the lens. That idea made me sweat. I worried about what would happen if she actually appeared face to face. Did she want something from me? Would she just stand there and stare? Was it some kind of warning? Around mid-afternoon, my doorbell rang. The sound made me jump so hard I almost knocked over my coffee. My heart hammered. I approached the door quietly, then looked through the peephole. It was just a delivery guy. I opened the door a crack, took the package, mumbled thanks, and locked up again. My nerves were so shot that even normal human contact felt jarring. I realized I was shaking. That night, I gathered all the photos that included the woman and laid them out in chronological order on my screen. In the earliest ones, she was tiny, almost indistinguishable in the background. Then, photo by photo, she moved closer. Each image seemed to reduce the distance by a few feet, or maybe a few yards. Sometimes she'd be half hidden, but I could still tell she was inching in. Her face remained mostly unclear until that shot in the bell tower. There, her face was almost fully visible. I stared at those eyes. They were hard to read. She didn't look angry or sad. She just looked focused, like she was studying me. My throat felt tight. I considered smashing my hard drive or deleting the photos, but I also worried about losing my professional work. I had important files stored there, not just these creepy images. Instead, I backed everything up onto external drives and hid them in a drawer. I didn't know why I did that. Maybe a part of me wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The next few days, I tried to live normally. I went shopping for groceries, did some light editing, and even took a short walk around the block, but kept my camera at home. I didn't want to take any new pictures. The thought of seeing her again was unbearable. I felt hyper-aware of every person on the street, watching people's clothes, faces, and eyes. Still, the tension in my neck refused to go away. Yesterday afternoon, a potential client called about taking pictures of a restored mansion on the outskirts of town. The pay was good, but the job wouldn't be for a couple of weeks. I told him I needed time to think. After hanging up, I sat on my couch, staring at the blank wall, feeling an ache in my chest. I have no idea how to handle this situation. If I keep taking jobs, I'll keep seeing her. If I stop, I'll have no income, and I don't even know who she is or what she wants. All I know is that she's out there, and I have a feeling she's not going away. She gets closer in every picture. She never talks or makes a sound I can clearly trace. But she's there, watching. I can explain how it started, or why it continues. I just know that I see her in my photos and feel like she's following me. I don't know what happens if she ever reaches the camera, or what I'll see when she's finally just a breath away. And that's what scares me most. I still remember the first time I heard the whispers. I was alone in my workshop late at night with nothing but an old floor lamp lighting my bench. My hands were dusty from sanding the top of a Victorian chest of drawers, which I had picked up at an estate sale a week earlier, thinking it would be a straightforward project. When I first touched it, I felt a slight unease, but I brushed it off as fatigue. I don't usually get rattled by small stuff. I've been a restorer for over 15 years and have worked on pieces with strange histories, but this one was different. I felt a light draft against my ear and heard a faint voice. It sounded like a breathless whisper, something like a single word or a short phrase. I paused and looked around. My workshop is a large open space with a wall of windows facing the street. There's a concrete floor, a high ceiling with exposed beams, and scattered tables covered in half-finished projects. I have my tools sorted in clear plastic bins, everything labeled. That night, everything was quiet except for the hum of a small fan in the corner. I listened again but heard nothing. I thought I must have been tired. I wiped my hands on a rag and decided to close up for the evening. When I locked the front door and stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something. My neck felt tense, and my breathing was uneven. I drove home and tried to watch TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that whisper. It didn't sound like a breeze or the building settling. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, then got cut off. I ignored it for the rest of the night and went to bed early. The next morning I went back to the workshop at sunrise. I wanted to get a fresh start on sanding the edges of the chest of drawers. I turned on the overhead lights, put on my respirator, and used a piece of fine grit sandpaper to work around the drawers. As I ran the paper along the decorative trim, I heard the whisper again. This time it lasted longer. It was coming from inside the chest. My body tensed. My hands froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned closer, placed my ear near the opening where the drawer slides, and waited. The whisper repeated a short phrase. It sounded like my last name. I yanked my head away and stood still for several seconds. I told myself this had to be in my head. Maybe I was stressed. Maybe I needed a break, but it didn't feel imaginary. It was too clear. I decided to continue the restoration and see if it stopped. I pulled out my tools and started tightening some loose screws on the back panel. That's when I heard it again, only clearer. It said something about my father. It mentioned details about him that I thought only I knew. The scar on his left hand, the signet ring he used to wear. I dropped the screwdriver and backed up until I hit my work table. I stared at the chest of drawers, breathing hard. I called my father right away. He lives a couple of towns over. I asked if he had any connection to a Victorian chest of drawers, but he insisted he had never owned one. I mentioned the details I heard, but he got defensive. He told me not to believe rumors and changed the subject. I hung up, feeling uneasy. I decided to take the chest outside to see if it would help clear my head. I carried it into the back alley, set it on a sturdy crate, and tried to continue sanding. Even outside in the open air, the whispers didn't fade. They got louder. It wasn't just one voice now. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, though I couldn't make out individual words. My hands started to tremble. I looked around, but no one was there. The alley was empty. I took the chest back inside and closed the garage door. I wanted to see if there was anything physically inside causing this sound. Maybe a hidden mechanism, or some wind tunnel effect when the drawers moved. I used a flashlight to examine the inside. It was mostly empty, with just old wood and a musty smell. No insects, no cracks big enough for a draft. I even used a small camera probe to get into the corners. Nothing. By noon, I couldn't focus. I kept hearing soft whispers, not constant but frequent enough that I felt a tight knot in my stomach. They were calling me by name. They were mentioning events I hadn't thought about for years, private things, embarrassing moments from my past. That afternoon, I got into my truck and drove to the estate sale address where I originally bought the piece. I wanted more information. The house was a large old Victorian with peeling paint. The front yard had weeds and a broken fence. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. A neighbor saw me and approached. She said the owners had passed the house to distant relatives who liquidated everything. I asked if she knew anything about the chest of drawers. She looked confused, saying she remembered seeing it in the living room, but it had always been locked. She didn't remember any keys. Then she just shrugged and walked away. I went back to my workshop frustrated. The whispers got stronger as soon as I stepped into the space. They spoke of a hidden letter taped underneath the bottom drawer. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I pulled the drawer out and flipped it over. Sure enough, there was a small envelope stuck there. My name was on it in faded ink. My hands shook as I slid it out. Inside, I found a piece of folded parchment. The handwriting was old-fashioned. It mentioned my grandfather describing events from the night. It said he was involved in some kind of illegal activity, something about forged documents. I had never heard about that. At the bottom, there was a note that said, "Trust no one." I sat on a stool, feeling sweat forming on my forehead. My grandfather never spoke about any trouble. He was always a quiet man who spent time in his workshop. I felt betrayed by the silence. I didn't understand how my name ended up on that envelope. The whispers in the chest got louder while I held the letter. I felt like they were pushing me to dig deeper. I stared at the chest, my heart pounding. The voices were urging me to ask my father more questions, to look for evidence in my grandfather's old shed. I took the chest to the corner of the room, covered it with a tarp, and locked up for the day. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning. My mouth felt dry, and I kept picturing that old parchment. I got out of bed around 5 a.m. and drove straight to my father's place. He has a small house on a quiet street. It was still dark when I arrived. He answered the door in his robe, looking confused. I told him I needed to see Grandpa's old shed. He hesitated, but eventually led me around back. The shed smelled like mold and sawdust. It was cramped, with a few old tools hanging on hooks. A rusty cabinet stood against the wall. My father insisted there was nothing of value inside, just junk. I pried open the cabinet and found old ledgers, receipts and notes. Most were faded, but one stack was wrapped in plastic. I pulled it out. My father's eyes darted around. He told me to be careful. I unwrapped the plastic and found documents that looked like they had official seals. Some were half-filled forms. I saw references to properties in different states and sums of money. I saw my grandfather's signature on them. My father sighed and admitted that my grandfather had been part of a fraud scheme. He said it ended badly and that they paid off some people to keep it quiet. He had sworn never to speak of it again. I felt a twist in my stomach. I realized the whispers were telling the truth. It wasn't an innocent piece of furniture. Somehow it held knowledge about my family's secrets. I told my father about the letter I found. He looked frightened. His hands were shaking, and he told me he had no idea how it got there. He said maybe Grandpa had hidden it in the chest, hoping I would find it one day. I asked him how Grandpa could have known I would buy that chest at some random estate sale. My father didn't have an answer. I drove back to my workshop with the documents. I walked in and immediately heard the whispers. They sounded urgent, like they wanted me to keep going. They revealed that there was a hidden compartment in the lower drawer. I rummaged through the chest of drawers again, pulling out each drawer, checking every inch. I found a loose board in the back of the lower drawer. When I pried it open, a small brass key fell out. It had a tiny number stamped on it. I recognized the number as part of a bank safe deposit box code. My heart pounded. I'd seen something like that in my father's papers once. I stashed the key in my pocket. The whispers seemed satisfied, almost quieter but still present. Over the next few days, the voices started predicting things. One morning they hinted that an important phone call would come from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I shrugged it off as nonsense. But that afternoon, my uncle, who had moved away a decade ago, called out of the blue. He wanted to ask about a property my grandfather had owned. I nearly dropped my phone when I realized the whispers had warned me. They also mentioned a hidden safe in my father's basement, filled with old records. When I confronted my father, he looked at me like I was reading his mind. He admitted that there indeed was a sealed safe that Grandpa had left behind. He said it was just old photos and some jewelry, but I wasn't sure I believed him. Each day I returned to the workshop, and each day the chest of drawers gave me another piece of information. I started wearing earplugs to block it out, but I could still feel the buzzing in my head. It never hurt, but it made me anxious. My shoulders were always tight. I caught myself sweating when I was near the chest. I felt a constant need to check it, to open the drawers, to listen. The predictions kept coming true. Small things like visitors showing up unannounced, or random appliances breaking down, or a sudden change in the weather. The bigger stuff related to my family's hidden business. I found myself digging into bank statements, property deeds, old crates, and Grandpa's shed. Every time I found something new, the voices calmed for a moment like I was doing what they wanted. I started to worry about my own sanity. I tried to get rid of the chest of drawers. I put it up for sale online, but nobody showed any interest, which was unusual for a Victorian piece in decent shape. I considered hauling it to a warehouse, but the moment I tried loading it into a truck, the whispers grew harsh. I felt a headache forming right behind my eyes, and it only eased when I brought the chest back inside. It was as if it didn't want to leave. I gave up and set it against a wall, draping it with a thick cloth. One afternoon, I decided to confront the chest directly. I pulled off the cloth and stood in front of it. I spoke out loud, telling it that I knew what it was doing, that I knew it was connected to my family's secrets. I felt a vibration under my feet, like a subtle tremor in the concrete. The voices whispered about how everything was set in motion decades ago, and how I was just the final piece in the puzzle. I felt lightheaded, but refused to back away. After that, the chest's predictions started focusing on me. It whispered things about my next steps, who would contact me next, what I would discover in the bank safe deposit box. I tried to ignore it. I didn't sleep well, my eyes felt raw from lack of rest. My appetite was gone. I kept pacing around my workshop. The chest was always on my mind. I had opened some dark family history and there was no going back. My father stopped taking my calls, probably worried that I'd dig up something that would implicate him or other relative in Grandpa's old crimes. Finally, I decided to follow one last lead. I took the brass key and visited the bank that matched the code. I asked if there was a deposit box under my grandfather's name. The clerk hesitated, but after I showed ID and explained that my grandfather had passed away and left his estate behind, she led me to a private room. Inside the box I found old black and white photos of my grandfather with unknown business partners. I found receipts for large sums of money, passports with different names, and a few pieces of jewelry. Nothing indicated violence, but it was clear that he had led a double life. I took the box contents, locked it back up, and walked out feeling tense. Back at my workshop, I set the photos and papers on the bench. The chest's whispers rose again, urging me to look behind one photo in particular. I slid it out of its frame and saw a final note scrawled across the back. It was my grandfather's handwriting. He wrote that he regretted his mistakes, that he hoped I would forgive him, that the chest of drawers had been part of his life's biggest risk. He apologized for leaving me to discover his secrets this way. I stared at the note, uncertain how to react. My chest felt tight. The whispering sounded calmer, like a soft breeze. I placed the note on the table and decided to finish the restoration. I sanded the surfaces until they were smooth. I applied a fresh stain. I fixed the loose handles. I worked methodically, focusing on each detail. The whispers guided me to a few hidden cracks, telling me where I needed to reinforce the wood. By the time I applied the final coat of varnish, the voices were barely audible. They sounded like they were fading. At the end of that day, I stepped back and looked at the restored chest of drawers. It looked solid and polished, ready for use. I felt uneasy, but also a little relieved. I realized I'd learned all the chest had to tell me. My family's secrets were out in the open. I pulled the tarp over it one last time, locked up the workshop, and drove home. The whispers didn't follow me that night. I still have the chest stored in a corner of my workshop, sitting quietly under its covering. I haven't heard any new whispers in weeks. My father and I have barely spoken, but I know we'll have to talk about everything soon. I feel a strange sense of closure, though it hasn't wiped away the tension. Part of me wonders if the chest has more to reveal, if it's just waiting for the right time. But for now, it's silent and I'm trying to move on. I can say everything feels normal, but I'm not hearing those whispers anymore. I don't know if that's a good sign or just the calm before something else happens. Either way, I'm done restoring it. In keeping it locked away, if it starts whispering again, I'm not sure what it'll do. But for now, it'll live with what I know, and that's more than enough. I moved into my new apartment 6 weeks ago. I'm a lawyer, so I like clear terms and solid facts. I want to understand every detail before I commit to something. That's why I spent 3 months looking for the right place. When I found this apartment, it seemed perfect. It was close to the courthouse. The rent was reasonable, and the interior looked brand new. I thought I had scored a real deal. But now, every night feels like a tightrope walk between two worlds. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened step by step, without dressing it up or hiding anything. On my first day here, I unpacked all my boxes in one long stretch. My back hurt from lifting heavy files and hauling my old bookcase. By the time I was done, it was almost midnight. I remember taking a quick shower and falling into bed. The mattress was on the floor because I hadn't assembled the bed frame yet. I didn't notice anything strange that night. I slept hard, woke up in the morning, and continued settling in. Things changed on the third night. It started out normal. I was brushing my teeth, staring at myself in the bathroom mirror. I felt a little uneasy, but I chalked it up to stress from my new job responsibilities. My law firm had me on a big case, so maybe I was just on edge. I finished brushing my teeth, flicked off the bathroom light, and went to bed. I can say how long I slept. I just know I opened my eyes and felt something was off. It was dark, but I sensed the room felt reversed. I reached out to my left, expecting the nightstand. My hand touched empty space. That alone made my chest tighten. I turned on the small lamp I keep near the bed, but it wasn't there. Instead, I found a lamp on what should have been the opposite side of the bed. It had the same color and shape, but it wasn't in the right place. I got up and walked around.
The layout was flipped.
Furniture was on the wrong sides. The closet door was on the left side of the hallway, not the right. Light switches felt reversed. The bathroom sink was on the opposite wall. It looked exactly like my apartment, only mirrored. I felt a rush of panic, but I tried to keep calm. Maybe I was dreaming? It felt real, though. My heart was pounding. I could feel my own breath and hear the hum of the fridge. I turned on the kitchen light to check if anything else was strange. The counters were reversed too. Even the faucet handle seemed swapped. My stomach twisted. I tried to assure myself it was just a vivid nightmare. I thought that if I went back to bed, maybe I'd wake up in my normal apartment. My throat felt dry, so I drank some water and returned to bed, forcing my eyes shut. Eventually, I drifted off again. In the morning, everything was normal. My nightstand was back on its usual side. The closet door was where it was supposed to be. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't ignore the sweat on my neck and the tightness in my chest. I told myself it had to be stress. I stayed late at the office that day, reviewing contracts and focusing on anything that would keep my mind from wandering back to that weird night. But the same thing happened the next night, and the night after that. It started the same way. I'd fall asleep, then wake up in the middle of the night in a reversed apartment. The first few times it was just the visual layout that changed. But soon, smaller details began shifting. The pictures I had hung on the walls in the living room had different frames. The carpet in the hallway was a darker shade. The tile in the bathroom had a faint pattern I had never seen before. Each time I woke up with a jolt of confusion that made my heart thud. My skin got clammy, and I had to fight the urge to run out the door. But I never actually left the apartment. I was too scared to see what might be outside. I tested a few things to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. One night, I left a glass on the coffee table before going to bed. When I woke up in that reversed version, the glass was on the opposite corner, like everything else was mirrored. I started leaving notes on my phone, typing down exactly what had changed. I'd write about the color of the walls, the patterns on the curtains, and the position of my furniture. When I woke up the next morning in my normal apartment, I'd compare those notes to the actual layout. Everything in the normal apartment stayed the same as when I fell asleep, but in that nighttime place, details kept shifting subtly. It was never a full redesign. Instead, it was all small variations piling up. It kept me on edge because it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't predict what would change next. On the 7th or 8th night, I tried staying awake. I figured if I never fell asleep, maybe I wouldn't wake up in that reversed apartment. I drank coffee, took short walks around the living room, and even tried calling a friend. But it was too late, and I didn't want to sound like a complete lunatic. My eyes burned from exhaustion. Around 3 in the morning, my body demanded rest. My lids felt heavy, and I ended up collapsing on the couch. About an hour later, I came to in the reversed apartment again. My body felt stiff. My neck hurt, and I was lying on the couch that was now on the opposite side of the room. I cursed under my breath. I felt trapped in some kind of twisted puzzle. When the differences grew more disturbing, I considered moving out. One night, I noticed the front door was gone. It wasn't in its usual spot. Instead, there was just a blank wall. My throat went tight, and my palms got sweaty. I pushed on the wall. It felt solid. There was no handle, no outline of a door. Nothing. I checked the bedroom door and saw it was in the right spot. That's when I realized I might not be able to leave if I wanted to. The sense of being trapped made my heart slam against my ribcage. I took deep breaths, trying to stay calm. I repeated to myself that this would end when I woke up in the morning. The next day, I found my door in its normal place, but that memory stuck with me. Another time, I found the windows had changed shape. Instead of wide rectangles, they were narrow slits. The curtains I had hung were bunched up on the floor, useless. I could see the streetlights outside, but they looked different, as if they were placed at strange angles. I couldn't see any cars. Usually there's a bit of traffic on my block, even late at night. That emptiness pushed my anxiety higher. I felt like I was in an abandoned version of my own neighborhood. My body reacted with a tight stomach and a shaky feeling in my arms. I felt like my body was locked in a low-level panic. I tried different tactics to break the cycle. I put sleeping pills in my nightstand, hoping that if I took them, maybe I'd stay unconscious long enough not to witness the shift. But it didn't help. Even if I took something to knock me out, at some point I'd open my eyes in that reversed apartment. It happened no matter what I tried. One night, I hammered a nail into the wall of my normal apartment to see if it would be there in the reversed version. I woke up in the reversed version and found the nail on the opposite wall, right where it logically should be if everything was mirrored. The biggest shock came about 3 weeks later. I woke up, looked around, and realized the reversed apartment now had cracks in the ceiling. They weren't there before. The paint along the edges of the ceiling was peeling. The walls looked grimy, as if nobody had cleaned them in years. My furniture was dusty, and the entire place smelled musty. I ran my finger along the tabletop and saw a thick coat of dust. That made me breathe faster. It felt like my apartment had aged overnight in this mirrored dimension. I wondered if I was seeing a future version or a neglected alternate version. But I tried not to dwell on that. My main focus was getting through the night. When I returned to my normal apartment in the morning, everything was still clean, fresh, and in good shape. I felt relief, but it was a short-lived feeling. I had to go to work and pretend everything was fine. My boss asked me why I looked tired and edgy. I just said I'd been working late. I couldn't tell him I was flipping between 2 realities each night. That sounded ridiculous, and I didn't want to risk my career. A few nights after that, I noticed something else that really bothered me. In the reversed apartment, some of my personal items were missing. My law textbooks were gone. The framed certificate from law school wasn't on the wall. My suits weren't in the closet. Instead, there were empty hangers. I kept searching for a clue, but I couldn't find any of my belongings that tied me to my legal career. I found generic clothes in the drawers. T-shirts, plain pants, no suits or ties. That unsettled me. It made me question my own identity in that place. At this point, I wasn't sure which apartment was real. I'd fall asleep in the normal one, but I'd wake up in the reversed one. Then I'd fall asleep there and wake up back in the normal version. During the day, everything seemed typical, but during the night, I entered a messed up reflection of my life. It wasn't killing me, and there were no direct threats, but the constant uncertainty felt like it was eroding my sanity. I tried not to think about long-term consequences. I just focused on coping with each night. The most unnerving experience happened around the start of my 4th week. I woke up in the reverse apartment as usual, but the lights in the hallway were flickering. The bulbs in the ceiling looked old. I heard a buzzing noise from somewhere, like a faulty electrical circuit. The walls felt closer than usual, and the furniture was spread out in weird angles. The coffee table was flipped. The couch was halfway across the room, and the curtains on the windows were torn. I noticed a cold draft coming from a gap beneath the front wall. There was still no door. I pressed my ear against that wall and heard a faint dripping sound, steady and rhythmic, like water hitting a metal bucket. My heart pounded in my throat. I had no idea what was out there. I stayed close to the wall for a minute, hoping to learn something, but it only made me feel more uneasy. At that moment, my head started throbbing. My hands were shaking. I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't. The only thing I could do was try to sleep again. So I lay down on the couch, staring at the flickering lights. My skin felt clammy. I inhaled slowly, closed my eyes, and tried to force myself into unconsciousness. My mind kept racing with questions. Did I cause this? Is there a way to wake up faster? Am I actually awake now, or am I stuck in a loop? Somehow I managed to drift off. When I woke up again, I was back in the normal apartment. I checked the time on my phone. It was 4:50. I felt dizzy and nauseous, but relieved. I got up, ran to the bathroom, and splashed water on my face. The reflection looked normal. The sink was on the correct side. I noticed my knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the counter. I took a few deep breaths and decided I'd had enough. My plan was to pack my things and leave the next day. I didn't care if I had to break the lease. My peace of mind mattered more. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. I told her I wanted to find a new apartment as soon as possible. She said she'd line up some viewings for me. That night, I put my suitcases in the living room. I didn't pack them completely, but I wanted everything ready to go. I sat on my bed, flipping through channels on the TV, trying not to doze off. Eventually, my eyes got heavy again. I fought it, but I lost. The second I blinked for too long, I felt that heavy slide into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the reversed place. This time there was a single suitcase near the door. It looked like my suitcase, but older. Its zipper was broken, and the fabric was torn.
I walked over to it.
It was empty. The rest of the room looked battered. The paint was peeling in big patches. The overhead light was flickering non-stop, and the couch cushions were ripped, with stuffing poking out. I couldn't imagine living in a place like this. It felt more like a condemned building than a home. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, and my breath came in quick bursts. I picked up the suitcase and slammed it against the wall where the front door should be. I heard a dull thud. The wall didn't budge, so I kept pounding until I felt pain in my shoulder. It was useless. I decided to move to the bedroom. Maybe I could sleep there and return to the normal apartment. But when I walked in, the bed was gone. The entire room was empty except for a single chair in the corner. The window was bricked up. I felt trapped, like the apartment itself was swallowing my options. My heart was pounding so hard that my vision blurred at the edges. I forced myself to sit in that chair. My lungs felt tight, and the air was cold enough to make me shiver. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sound of my own breathing. I refused to think about where I was. I just needed to escape. After some time, I don't know how long, I managed to drift off. When I woke up, I was back in my normal bedroom. My suitcase was still on the floor intact. The walls were clean, and the bed was in its right place. Relief flooded me. The next day, I told my real estate agent that I would take the first decent apartment she showed me. I didn't care about the rent or the size. I just wanted out. She found a smaller place in a nearby neighborhood. It wasn't as nice, but at that point I didn't care. I signed a lease the same day. Right now, I'm in the process of packing. I'm trying to stay awake until I can move all my stuff out. I'm not sure if moving will solve the problem, but I have to try. I feel a sense of urgency, like time is running out. My biggest fear is that if I spend one more night here, I might not come back to this reality in the morning. That's my story. It's direct and unsettling, and I don't have a neat ending. I wish I could say I figured out the cause and fixed it. I haven't. All I can do is leave this place behind and hope it doesn't follow me. I'm a lawyer, but there's no contract that covers this kind of thing. All I have are my instincts telling me to get out before something worse happens. So, that's exactly what I'm going to do. As soon as the sun rises, I'm loading up a truck and driving away. And if this reverse department tries to pull me back, they'll fight it with everything I have.
You're not staying here another night?
That's my only plan, and I hope it's enough. I could hear them again last night right through the wall. At first, I thought someone had broken in, so I rushed into my living room, my heart pounding. Nobody was there. The place was silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the faint buzzing of a neighbor's TV. But I stood still, catching my breath, and heard those voices speaking in Latin. Clear syllables traveled through the drywall, and it felt like they were aimed at me. I'm a professor of ancient history, so the language wasn't strange to me. But I couldn't make sense of how the voices got there. I had no idea if I was dreaming, overworked, or just hallucinating. But the words were real enough to make the hair on my arm stand on end. He'll explain how it started. 3 weeks ago, right after dinner, I was washing dishes in the kitchen. I'd had a quiet day at the university. My classes ended early, and I got home around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I felt pretty relaxed, so I turned on some jazz music while I scrubbed a pot. Then the music cut out. I heard static for a couple of seconds, and then I heard 2 or 3 voices speaking in an even tone. I recognized some words: ritus, ordo, sacerdos, ritual, order, priest. I lowered the volume on the radio, making sure I wasn't mixing up the broadcast with some weird interference. But the voices sounded like they came from inside my wall. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, my hands still wet with soap suds. My chest felt tight, and my breathing turned shallow. For the next minute, I just listened. They were speaking in a conversational tone, but everything was in Latin. I caught a few phrases about an upcoming ceremony. They spoke about needing a new officiant. They mentioned some old-sounding names, or maybe they were references to Roman gods. I'm not sure. My Latin is decent, but I was too stunned to translate everything perfectly. I stepped back and dried my hands, thinking maybe there was some logical explanation. Maybe some shortwave radio was picking up a weird broadcast next door. I tried to shake it off, but I felt my pulse thumping in my neck. I didn't know what else to do, so I finished washing the dishes and sat down on my couch. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to those voices. I live alone, so there was nobody to ask if they heard it too. I must have checked my front door and windows 5 times. Everything was locked. At around 3 a.m., I drifted off for about 2 hours and woke up still tired, but I had to go teach a class on Roman religious rites. The irony didn't escape me. I arrived at campus early, fueled by strong coffee, and tried to focus on my lecture notes. But the entire class, I kept remembering the words ordo and sacerdos. I was sure I'd heard them through my wall. Over the next few days, I forced myself to keep a routine. I got up, ate breakfast, went to campus, lectured, graded papers, and came home. Each evening, I tried to distract myself with TV or reading, but the voices would pop up around midnight. They usually spoke for about 10 minutes, always in that calm, steady Latin. Sometimes I recognized words referencing sacrifices, but nobody talked about actual killing or anything like that. Still, it felt ominous. They talked about incense, altars, and something about a hidden location. My gut churned each time I heard the voices. I kept pacing around the house, pressing my ear against different walls. I'd check the basement, flip on the lights, and find nothing but dusty old boxes. After a week, I felt like I was losing my grip. My body got jumpy, and my appetite dropped. I started triple-checking every corner of the house. My eyes would dart around at the slightest creak or rustle. One night, the voices seemed louder. I was lying in bed, half awake, and I could hear them through the headboard. I sat up, staring into the darkness. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. The voice closest to me said something about Novus Dux, which means new leader or new guide. That made me sit there stiff as a board, sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to respond in Latin, asking who they were, but there was no answer. They just kept talking among themselves. My breath got shallow, and my mouth felt dry. I turned on the bedside lamp and stood up, my knees feeling shaky. As I pressed my ear to the wall, the voices faded out. Silence. The only thing I heard was my own breathing, ragged and uneven. I tested the wall with my knuckle, giving it a light knock. It sounded hollow. I'd always known the walls were thin, but never suspected anything behind them. The next day, I decided to call a friend who's an archaeologist with some side interests in weird transmissions and old languages at the university. He said no, he'd never heard of radio interference that sounded like ancient voices, but mentioned that sometimes old buildings pick up faint frequencies. He also reminded me that stress or exhaustion can cause auditory hallucinations. I didn't like that answer. I wanted a logical explanation, but refused to believe I was just hearing things. I felt too alert, too grounded, despite my tension. So I just thanked him and hung up, feeling more alone than before. That night, the voices came back. I sat in my living room with a notepad, determined to write down everything I understood. I left all my lights on. The time was around 11:45 p.m. My house was quiet. I waited, tapping a pen against my thigh. My nerves were on edge. Then I heard them again, right behind the bookshelf this time. I practically jumped off my chair and knelt down, pressing my ear to the corner. There were at least 2 distinct voices, maybe 3. They repeated certain words: tempus, paratus, invoke, and discipulus. I wrote them down, not entirely sure of the exact context, but I knew they were talking about preparing someone, preparing me for something. My stomach tightened and I felt a wave of cold sweat on my back. The next morning, I couldn't face going to the university. I emailed my department, claiming a migraine. Then I spent hours searching my house for hidden rooms or old plumbing vents that might transmit sound from somewhere else. I found nothing. When I looked behind the bookshelf, I noticed some scuff marks on the hardwood floor, like the bookshelf had been moved slightly in the past. I tried moving it aside, but it was heavy, and I had to push with my shoulder. The shelf slid a few inches, revealing a small door in the wall. It was maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet high. The paint around it looked chipped, as if someone had opened it multiple times before. My mouth felt dry again, and my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the latch. I yanked the door open. Inside, there was a narrow crawl space that smelled like old plaster and dust. I shone my phone's flashlight in there. I could see a rough wooden floor and some strange symbols carved into one of the beams. The symbols looked half Roman, half something else. My heart hammered in my chest as I crawled inside, trying to keep my breathing steady. I felt each board creak under my knees. The space was cramped, and I had to duck my head. After a few feet, I saw a small low table with a layer of dust on it. On top of it lay an old piece of parchment. I leaned in, shining my light on it. The parchment had Latin writing discussing some kind of ceremony that involved chanting and anointing. It mentioned a priest who must be pure of heart, but it didn't say anything about blood or violence. I backed out of there, dust caking my hands, and closed the little door. My head buzzed. I couldn't believe what I'd found. Someone at some point had used this crawl space as a private area to study or carry out rituals. Maybe it was the previous owner. Maybe it was older than that. I felt jittery but also weirdly intrigued. I spent the rest of the day locked in my office, analyzing the text. It was definitely centuries old, referencing an ancient Roman rite that survived in secret. The words specifically mentioned a cycle, repeating every certain number of years in which a new leader would be chosen. I recognized references to an ancient group that I'd read about in dusty archives, but never found any real evidence for. Things escalated that night. The voices started around 10 p.m., earlier than usual. I sat in the living room with my notes spread out on the coffee table, trying to organize everything. Suddenly, the house felt cold. I heard footsteps above me even though I knew I was alone. The voices echoed from the ceiling, saying things like Augustus, which can mean right or just, and indigia, which can mean to declare or indicate. They repeated these words several times. My throat felt tight, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I climbed the stairs, one hand on the banister, the other clutching my phone. I heard the voices more clearly at the top of the landing. They seemed to be coming from the spare bedroom I barely use. The door was closed. I stood there, my heart pounding, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I pushed it open, flicking on the light. The voices stopped abruptly. The room was empty. just the old bed frame and a desk with some old papers on it. I let out a long breath, my ears ringing from the adrenaline. I felt like I was being herded, like something wanted me to keep moving through the house. I walked to the desk, rummaging through the drawers. I found a dusty old dictionary of Latin terms in a small black notebook. Inside the notebook were notes in Latin, references to rituals, dates, all sorts of cryptic details about an ancient cult. My brain pulsed with stress, and I felt a tingling sensation in my fingers. I scanned the pages quickly. They mentioned the same group from the parchment. They talked about preparing the place for the next officiant, ensuring the house was consecrated. I realized they'd been planning this for a long time. The notes ended with a line about "He who teaches the past will guide the future." That made my legs weak. I teach ancient history. I started breathing faster. I decided to sleep on the couch that night with all the lights on, but I barely dozed off. Around 3 a.m., I heard whispering from the walls again. This time it was just one voice repeating a short phrase. It sounded like instructions. I recognized a command telling me to go to the crawl space again. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I got up, feeling cornered. I pushed the bookshelf aside again, crawled in, and found that the small table now had a new parchment on it. Or maybe it was always there, and I just missed it the first time. It was a list of items needed for a ceremony. Candles, a bowl of water, a robe, a small metal emblem shaped like an ancient temple. My hands shook as I held the parchment. My mind raced with questions. Who placed it there? Why? I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears again. The adrenaline made my face hot. I pulled myself out and sat on the floor. My limbs felt shaky, and I kept wiping sweat from my forehead. I realized this wasn't just random voices or leftover items from a previous owner. This was intentional. Something was actively guiding me to become the next officiant of this old ritual. I didn't want any part of it, but I felt like the house, the voices, and the hidden texts were pushing me in that direction. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it all. I taught my classes, graded papers, and pretended everything was normal. But each night the voices grew more insistent. They sometimes chanted my name, my actual name in Latin form. They told me to gather the items. They repeated the same instructions. Get the candles, the water, and the emblem. My pulse would spike every time I heard them mention the new officiant. One evening I decided to just do it, to see if it would shut them up, or give me a clue. I bought tall white candles from a local store, filled a steel bowl with water from my kitchen tap, and found a robe in my closet that looked plain enough. I had no idea where to get the emblem, but I remembered my office at the university had a small Roman temple replica that someone gave me as a novelty gift. I drove there after hours, quietly let myself in, and grabbed it. My hands shook the entire time, and I felt like someone was watching me. But nobody was in the corridors. The campus was dark and empty. When I got back home, I spread the items on my kitchen table. My stomach churned and I felt a tension behind my eyes like a headache forming. The voices started again, guiding me to the crawl space. I dragged everything through that little door, practically crawling on my elbows, coughing in the dust. Once inside, I set up the candles around the small table, lit them, and placed the water bowl in the center. The robe felt scratchy against my bare arms. My heart was pounding, and I was sweating. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone or something to appear in the shadows. The voices guided me in short, simple commands. I repeated phrases in Latin that I only half understood. My throat felt tight. I was shaking so much the candle flames flickered. The air smelled like burnt wax and dust. I poured a little water on my hands. As instructed, my arms tingled. My breathing turned ragged. The voices praised me, calling me the new officiant, telling me to keep going. I said something about dedicating myself to the ritual. I just followed the prompts, feeling trapped and compelled at the same time. After I finished, the voices stopped. The silence felt heavy, like a thick blanket over my ears. My head throbbed and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I blew out the candles, crawled back, and shut the little door. I leaned against the wall, my shirt sticking to my skin. I felt a wave of relief but also a jolt of fear. I knew this wasn't over. It felt like an initiation. In the following days, the walls stayed quiet. I would sometimes catch a faint whisper, but nothing like before. I kept the items hidden in the crawl space, not sure what to do with them. I tried to focus on work, forging through my lectures about the Roman Empire with forced enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being monitored. At home, I'd sometimes sense a presence behind me, or catch a sound like soft chanting, but nothing as intense as the full-blown conversations. Now 3 weeks later, I'm living in a constant state of guarded tension. I know there's more to come. The text mentioned repeated ceremonies, each one more involved than the last. The group behind this must exist somewhere, orchestrating these whispers to prepare me. I hate the feeling, but part of me is curious. This house has secrets, and somehow, I've stepped into a role that was left here for me. I'm a professor of ancient history, and now I'm part of an ancient practice. I don't know what's next, but each time I lie down to sleep, I half expect to hear a voice in Latin telling me to get ready again, and I know I won't be able to resist. I'm ready, or maybe just too far gone to fight it. The ritual has started, and I'm in it now. I still remember the day I got those Victorian mirrors. I was at an estate sale picking through a room filled with old furniture and random objects. My shop wasn't doing great, but I had enough customers interested in vintage mirrors and odd trinkets. When I saw this set of 5 tall mirrors lined up along a wall, I noticed the intricate wooden frames and the slight stains along the edges of the glass. Each one looked heavy and worn, but something about them caught my eye. The seller told me they'd been stored in an attic for decades. I bought them on impulse. I figured I could clean them up and sell them for a decent price. I hauled them back to my store in my old pickup. I remember how each mirror rattled in the bed, even though I had them wrapped in blankets. My muscles burned as I lifted them out one by one and leaned them against the back wall of my shop. I own a small place on a side street, so I had to squeeze them around a bunch of other items. I wiped the dust off them, but I didn't pay too much attention to the glass. I was in a hurry that day. The next morning, I walked into my shop about half an hour before opening. I flipped the lights on and glanced at those mirrors. Right away, I noticed that something seemed off about my reflection in the center mirror. At first, I thought the glass had a wave or distortion in it. I moved closer to get a better look. My reflection seemed normal except for a slight difference in how my hair was parted. I ran my hand over my head and felt my usual part, but in the mirror my hair parted on the other side. I looked at the other mirrors, but those reflections looked fine. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just some warping in the glass. Later that day, a customer came in and asked about the mirrors. I told him they weren't ready for sale yet. I planned to refinish the frames and polish the glass. While I talked, I kept noticing that center mirror from the corner of my eye. My reflection seemed to shift as if I were watching someone who moved at a slightly different speed than me. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept my focus on the customer. After he left, I tried to ignore the mirrors and got on with pricing some other antiques. Over the next few days, I rearranged my shop to display the mirrors. I put them in a row along the left wall and tried to set them at matching angles. People would come in and admire the craftsmanship of the frames, but they didn't buy them. When I had downtime, I'd find myself standing in front of them, looking for any irregularities. Sometimes the second mirror on the left showed me a few inches taller than I really am. Sometimes the first mirror made me look thinner. At other times, I couldn't see a difference at all. After a week of this, I started to get more curious. I decided to examine each mirror carefully. I took a notepad and stood in front of the first one. It reflected me in my usual jeans and t-shirt, but I noticed my face looked a bit more tired. I saw lines around my eyes that I didn't notice in real life. In the second mirror, I seemed a bit younger. In the third, everything looked normal at first, but then I realized my posture was straighter, and I looked more confident somehow. The fourth mirror had the strangest effect. It showed me wearing the clothes I had on, but there was a faded scratch on the glass right across my left shoulder in the reflection. In real life, there was no scratch on that area of the glass. The fifth mirror seemed to have the least distortion, but sometimes I saw a flicker, like a tiny movement that didn't match my own. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was all in my head. I thought maybe the glass was old and warped, or I was seeing illusions caused by the lighting in my shop. I tried different light bulbs, but that didn't fix anything. Customers started to comment on the odd reflections. Some said it was cool. Others said it felt creepy. I found myself drawn to these mirrors at closing time. I'd stand there, staring at my reflection. My breath would go shallow, and my neck would tense up. I'd look at my reflection in the first mirror, then the second, and so on. My image seemed to change from one to the next, but none of the changes made complete sense. Sometimes I saw myself with a slight limp in the second mirror, even though I've never had a leg injury. In the third mirror, I'd notice a ring on my finger that didn't exist. In real life, I've never worn any ring. One night, I stayed late to do inventory. I had the lights dimmed, and I was checking some old china sets. So I glanced at the mirrors, and I saw one of my reflections move out of sync. I froze. My heart pounded, and I held my breath. I watched as the reflection in the second mirror slowly raised its left hand while I stood completely still with both hands at my sides. I felt a chill spread across my back and my fingers started to tingle. The reflection eventually lowered its hand, then turned its head, as if it were looking away from me. I looked around the shop. Nothing else moved. I tried to calm myself by taking slow, deep breaths, but my chest felt tight. I walked up to the mirror, inches from the glass, and stared. My reflection stared back, perfectly mirroring me. I lifted my arm and it lifted its arm. I turned my head and it did the same. I felt a slight trembling in my legs, but I forced myself to stand there. After a minute or two, I backed away. I checked the other mirrors. Everything looked normal again. I closed the shop immediately and went home. I spent that night tossing and turning in bed, remembering that moment. I couldn't come up with a logical explanation. The next day, I told myself it must have been my imagination. I opened the shop as usual. Customers came and went and I stayed busy with other tasks. Around lunchtime, I took a quick break and stood in front of the fourth mirror, the one with that odd scratch that appeared over my shoulder and the reflection. I watched closely. The reflection looked just like me. But then I noticed that the scratch in the mirror lined up with a scar on my shoulder that I got years ago from an accident involving a nail in my normal reflection from a regular mirror. That scar is barely noticeable. In this mirror, it was highlighted by that scratch, almost as if it were a marker. I felt my pulse quicken. I reached back and touched my shoulder, feeling the faint line under my shirt. By the end of the second week, each mirror had shown me at least one major discrepancy. One reflection wore glasses. Another had a small tattoo on the forearm. Another had a slight beard. I caught glimpses of these changes at random times, and they never happened in more than one mirror at once. I felt tense all day waiting to see if it would happen again. When the shop was empty, I'd pace around, rubbing my hands together or flexing my shoulders to release some of the stress. I started leaving the lights on even after closing just so I wouldn't walk into a dark shop in the morning. One evening, I locked the door and covered all the mirrors with old sheets. I wanted to see if that would stop my mind from playing tricks on me. I felt a wave of relief when they were hidden. I left the shop, grabbed some takeout, and went back to my apartment to unwind. That night, I slept better than I had in days. The next morning, I pulled the sheets off to check if everything was still in place. The mirrors looked normal under the fluorescent lights, but after a moment I noticed faint smears on the glass, like handprints from the inside. I felt my stomach twist. I couldn't figure out how they got there. They were too light to be actual prints, more like the greasy outline of fingers. I rubbed the glass with a cloth, but the mark stayed. I decided to move the mirrors into my storage room in the back, away from the sales floor. I took them one by one, grunting with effort because they were so heavy. I set them against a concrete wall. The storage room had a single overhead light that flickered sometimes. In that harsh light, the mirrors looked even more ominous. My heart raced as I adjusted each mirror. When I stood them side by side, I saw all my reflections at once. Each of them looked slightly different even though I stood the same way in front of each mirror. One reflection had a bruise on the cheek. Another looked healthier, and another looked exhausted. I felt a lump form in my throat. My legs were shaky. I decided not to stare too long. I covered them again and went back to the front. Over the next week, I tried to forget about them, but sometimes I thought I heard faint sounds coming from the storage room, like a soft tapping or brushing noise. Whenever I entered that room, I felt short of breath. I started leaving the lights on there too. I felt a strange dread. Every time I walked by the door, my appetite dropped. I spent my days feeling on edge, jumping at small noises. At night, I'd lie awake, my mind racing with images of those reflections moving on their own. One afternoon, I was alone in the store. It was quiet, so I went to the storage room to check the inventory on some furniture. As I stepped inside, I saw that all the sheets were off the mirrors. My chest tightened, and my mouth felt dry. I was sure I'd covered them before. I walked closer and I saw my reflection standing there, each one slightly out of sync. The first one moved its head to the side as if it was studying me. The second seemed to hunch over. The third had a more direct stare. The fourth and fifth barely moved, but I could sense their eyes following me. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My throat felt tight. I wanted to grab something and break the mirrors, but I hesitated because they were valuable antiques. I also felt a strange fear of what might happen if I actually shattered them. So I tried to speak. My voice came out shaky. I asked, "Why are you doing this?" I felt stupid talking to my own reflection, but the words just came out. My reflections didn't speak. The one on the far left tilted its head again. The middle one lifted its arm slightly, then let it drop. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it in my ears. I stood there for a minute, breathing quickly. Then I realized I needed to do something. I went to the far side of the room and grabbed an old tarp. I swung it over the first mirror, trying not to look at the glass. Then I did the same for the next two. My fingers were trembling so much that I could hardly grip the tarp. My foot bumped against the corner of the third mirror, and I nearly knocked it over. I caught it just in time, my arm straining. When I finally covered them all, I stood back, panting. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and left the room. That night I locked the shop and double-checked everything. I felt a weird sense of violation, like the mirrors were intruding on my mind. My dreams were filled with disjointed images of me looking into mirrors that didn't match my movements. I saw myself older, younger, with different scars or tattoos. Each version had a different expression. I jerked awake several times, my pulse racing, my skin clammy. The next morning, I walked straight to the storage room. The tarps were still in place. I felt a slight relief. I thought maybe I could sell these mirrors as is to someone who wouldn't question their quirks. I stood there, thinking about the best way to list them. My chest felt heavy, and my shoulders were still tense from lack of sleep. Then I heard a soft scraping sound from behind the tarps. It was like nails brushing against glass. My eyes darted to the corner of the room. There was nothing else in there that could make that noise. My stomach felt tight, and I noticed I was holding my breath. I took a few steps closer, and the scraping sound stopped. I don't know how long I stood there listening. It felt like forever. Eventually I left the room and locked it behind me, even though the door didn't have a real deadbolt. I put a sign on the front door of my shop that said I was closed for the day. Then I sat behind my counter, trying to calm myself. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. My phone buzzed with messages, but I ignored it. My main concern was those mirrors in the back. I spent the rest of the day pacing around my shop, glancing at the storage room door, fighting the urge to check if the tarps were still there. Every time I heard a random creak or pop from the building, I jumped. My entire body felt tense. I felt a dull ache in my lower back from standing too long, and my knees got stiff from anxiety. I thought about calling someone to take the mirrors away, but I was afraid nobody would believe me if I told them what was happening. As evening approached, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I decided to haul the mirrors to my truck and bring them to a locked storage unit I rent across town. Maybe, if I got them away from my shop, I could regain my peace of mind. I grabbed a dolly and headed to the storage room. The door creaked as I opened it. The tarps were still in place, but as soon as I took a step inside, I felt like the air got heavier. My hands shook as I approached the first mirror. I carefully lifted it onto the dolly, trying not to let the tarp slip off. The mirror felt cold through the tarp, and the frame pressed hard against my palms. I kept my gaze on the floor. I wheeled it out to the truck and slid it into the bed, propping it up with some boards. Then I went back for the second one and the third until all 5 were loaded. The entire time, I felt the hairs on my arms standing up. My stomach churned. When I finished, I closed the tailgate and secured the straps. I locked up my shop, started the truck, and headed toward the storage unit. I tried not to look in the rearview mirror because I was afraid I'd catch a glimpse of something moving under those tarps. That's where I am now, parked outside my storage unit, trying to work up the courage to unload them. I can hear the wind rustling the tarp in the bed of my truck. My heart is thumping and my mouth is dry. I just need to get them inside, lock the door, and walk away. Then maybe I can forget about them at least for a while. I'm hoping this will give me some peace. I'm hoping those reflections stay quiet once they're locked up. I just want my life back. I just want to stop thinking about how my own reflection shouldn't be able to move on its own. And I want to stop feeling like there are different versions of me waiting behind that glass, watching my every move. I arrived at the research station 6 months ago expecting long days of cold, quiet work. I had requested this assignment because I enjoy solitude and assumed this place would offer me a peaceful break from crowded office spaces. My job was simple: monitor weather systems, record temperature changes, measure wind speeds, and watch for unusual patterns. I thought I'd just fight boredom and maybe some loneliness. Then, after the 3rd week, I started noticing a series of bizarre cloud formations. I saw shapes that looked too neat and symmetrical to be random. They weren't normal puffy outlines or vague silhouettes. They formed precise arcs and angles, almost like they had been designed. The first time I saw it, I thought I was overtired. The second time I took photographs, hoping to catch them for later review. But the pictures never showed the detail I saw with my own eyes. It drove me crazy. I was the only meteorologist on site. The station was a modest building with 3 rooms, a main lab, a small living space, and a storage area for supplies. Outside was a small yard for equipment, fenced off to protect it from wandering animals. There was no one around to confirm if I was imagining things. The only regular communication was a weekly radio check-in with headquarters. They usually ask for data temperatures, wind patterns, barometric readings. It was always routine. I tried to describe what I saw in the sky to them once, but they just told me to stay alert and keep recording data. They figured I was bored or playing around. I stopped mentioning it after a while. I made a habit of going outside every morning and evening to log cloud cover, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. One morning I saw 6 distinct cloud shapes in a row, each one shaped like a half circle, spaced evenly across the sky. They looked like arcs on a perfect blueprint. They stayed in place for 20 minutes, then vanished. I stood there in the cold air, feeling sweat run down my back. The breeze felt too still for such an odd configuration. My heart pounded. I wanted to call out for someone, but I knew there wasn't anybody around. After that, I tried to confirm whether I was going crazy. I started checking satellite images, but the satellite feed didn't pick up the patterns the same way. It just showed normal cloud clusters shifting around like standard weather formations. That gap between what I saw and what the data reported made me uneasy. I would stare at the computer, rubbing my eyes, wondering if I had lost my grip on reality. I felt my throat tighten every time I thought about it. Days turned into weeks, and each day the shapes got more complex. Sometimes they'd look like triangles arranged in precise rows. Other times I'd see circles within circles. One time I thought I saw letters, but they didn't match anything I recognized. The angles and lines looked unnatural. I tried to document everything in my logbook. I used my best drawings to replicate what I saw. Whenever I opened the book later, the sketches made me shudder. The proportions felt too exact, too deliberate. It didn't feel like random moisture drifting in the air. At some point I noticed changes in myself. I would stand outside looking up, and my arms would tingle. My mouth would dry up and I'd have to force myself to swallow. My stomach would clench as if I were anticipating something bad. I'd look over my shoulder, convinced that something was lurking behind me. But there was never anyone there. The wind sometimes felt like it was whispering. I'd hear faint sounds, a low hum, although I couldn't trace it to any piece of equipment. It seemed like it came from the sky itself. My sleep started to suffer. I would toss and turn at night, my mind replaying the shapes I'd seen. Sometimes I'd jolt awake, covered in sweat, convinced that I had heard a voice outside my window. When I got up to check, I'd see a clear night sky. No shapes, no arcs, just darkness, and a few faint stars. Then I'd stand there frozen, feeling my heart pound, unsure if I should go back to bed or stay up for the rest of the night. I tried to keep a schedule, brewing coffee in the morning, checking instruments, logging data, and doing a short walk around the station's perimeter to ensure everything was in order. I forced myself to do push-ups and sit-ups to keep my body active, and I made sure to eat at regular times. But those cloud formations kept appearing, and my mind couldn't rest. I felt shaky, like I'd had too much caffeine. I had trouble focusing on simple tasks. Every time a cloud drifted overhead, I'd panic that it might take a new shape. One afternoon, the shapes formed a spiral pattern, spinning slowly across the sky. I watched it for what felt like an hour. My feet were glued to the ground. My chest felt tight, like I was holding my breath. When the spiral finally broke apart, I realized my hands had gone numb from the cold and my lips were chapped from standing in the wind too long. I stumbled back inside, feeling unsteady on my feet. I splashed water on my face, but my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked strange. My eyes seemed red and tired, and I noticed that the muscles in my neck were tense and twitchy. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I got up around 2 a.m. to check the window, and I swore I saw faint lights moving behind the cloud layers. They flickered in a straight line, like a silent row of bulbs. I opened the door to get a better look, but the moment I stepped outside, the lights vanished. The sky looked normal again, but I felt a strange energy in the air, like static. The hairs on my arms stood up. My throat felt scratchy, and I thought I heard a quiet hum again, though I couldn't tell if it came from the wind or my own ears. The next morning, I tried to shake off the insomnia. I made strong coffee and went to gather temperature readings. As I stood near the instrumentation mast, I felt a slight tremor under my feet. It was so subtle that I thought maybe my legs were just weak. But then it happened again, a faint vibration like something moving underground. I tried to ignore it. The data didn't show any significant seismic activity. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a shift in the foundation of the station. Later that day, I saw clouds forming a grid, perfect squares aligned across the sky, about 10 of them side by side. I dropped my notepad on the ground. My heart pounded and my breathing got shallow. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stared, trying to see if they'd dissolve or stretch into normal cloud shapes, but they held their structure for a solid 5 minutes. I crouched down, rubbed my eyes, and kept looking. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they separated into thin streaks. I felt a wave of nausea. I had to sit on the steps outside the station, my pulse racing. My hands shook so badly that I almost couldn't hold my pen. I started to suspect these patterns were some kind of signal. I didn't know who or what was behind them. I tried to record them more systematically, writing down the time, temperature, and wind direction for each sighting, but the data never showed anything unusual. Barometric pressure stayed within normal ranges, wind speeds were typical for the region, and there was no precipitation that made no sense. I called headquarters again, telling them I'd been seeing repeating patterns in the clouds for weeks. The person on the other end said they'd forward my concerns to a senior meteorologist, but I never got a follow-up. I asked if they could send out a plane or drone to do a sky survey, but they said it wasn't a priority. I felt alone, with no backup. One evening, I decided to stay outside and watch the entire sunset. The sky went from blue to orange, then to deep purple. Just as twilight set in, I noticed a ring of clouds forming overhead, rotating slowly like a wheel. It looked thick, but there was no actual storm forming. The rotation was smooth, silent, and steady. I tilted my head, feeling the strain in my neck, and stared, waiting for lightning or thunder. Nothing happened. The ring kept rotating for at least 15 minutes. My chest got tight and my knees felt weak. I heard my own breathing, loud in my ears, and my mouth tasted bitter. Then the ring faded, melting into a normal cloud shape, and the sky went dark. That night, the humming in my ears seemed louder. I paced back and forth in the station's main lab. I kept glancing at the window, expecting something to peek in. My heart raced, and I noticed sweat forming on my forehead, even though the temperature was low. Every time the wind whistled, I'd flinch. I typed up a report on my computer, detailing every sighting for the past week. My hands shook. My throat felt dry. I kept trying to swallow, but it felt like a lump was stuck there. Around midnight, I decided to step outside again. I felt an urge to check the clouds as if something was calling me. The air felt thick and cold. My teeth chattered. I looked up, and for a few seconds I saw a new formation. It looked like diagonal lines arranged in parallel. They flickered in the moonlight, then dispersed.
My heart thudded.
I felt my chest tighten, and I had to breathe through my mouth. I backed up against the station wall, afraid I might fall. My head felt light, and a cold sweat dripped down my face. After that, I started having strange feelings inside the station. I'd be sitting at the computer, and I'd hear a soft static noise as though a radio was on low volume. I turn around and see nothing. Sometimes I feel pressure around my ears like I was ascending a mountain, but the altitude was the same as always. The station was at moderate elevation, so there was no reason for that feeling. My eyes felt strained, and I'd get headaches that pulsed in my temples. I'd rub my forehead, trying to make it stop, One afternoon, I walked into the storage area, looking for an extra blanket. The lights flickered, and my eyes struggled to adjust. I swore I saw a strange shape in the corner. It was just a shadow, probably, but my heart thumped, and I dashed out of there, feeling like I couldn't breathe. My hands shook for a solid minute afterward. Eventually, I reached a point where I couldn't deny that something was trying to communicate. Each cloud pattern looked intentional. Every time I saw one, I'd feel an odd electrical buzz in the air, and I'd hear that faint hum. I couldn't decode any actual message, but the repetition and precision seemed like a signal aimed at me. I wondered if it was natural or if it was something outside our typical understanding of weather. I decided I needed to capture more concrete evidence. I set up extra cameras, including a high-resolution lens on the roof. I stayed up all night one weekend recording time-lapse footage, but when I reviewed it, I found nothing out of the ordinary. My frustration grew. My stomach churned. I felt heat rising to my face. Every time I saw something in real time, it never showed up clearly on film. I'd see faint outlines, but nothing as vivid as what I witnessed with my own eyes. My routine calls to headquarters turned into desperate requests. I pleaded for someone to take me seriously, but they just said they'd look into it. I stopped sleeping well and ate less. My shoulders felt tight, and I developed a constant tension in my neck. Sometimes I'd stand by the window for hours, waiting for the next formation, certain I'd see it if I stayed alert. One night, the wind picked up, rattling the fence outside. The station creaked, and my door shuttered. I struggled to keep calm. I walked around the station, double-checking that everything was secured. I peered out the front door and saw clouds swirling in a pattern I hadn't witnessed before. They formed a grid, but then a circle appeared at the center, spinning slowly. My skin tingled, and my legs felt stiff. I heard that humming again, louder than before. It sounded like an electrical current coursing through the air. I gripped the door frame, breathing rapidly, my heart hammering in my chest. My mouth felt like cotton. I couldn't look away. The formation lasted longer than usual, 5 or 10 minutes. My body felt as if it was caught in some gravitational pull. Then, just as suddenly, everything dissolved. The wind died down, the clouds returned to random shapes, and the humming faded. My ears rang. I took a shaky step back, closed the door, and locked it. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was the precise geometry I'd just seen. After that, I realized I couldn't just ignore this anymore. I knew I'd probably lose my credibility if I kept insisting on these sightings without proof, but I couldn't help myself. I wrote a long email to headquarters describing every event in detail. I hit send, then turned off my laptop. My chest felt tight, and I had to step outside for fresh air. It was around 2 a.m., and everything was quiet. The sky was empty except for a few normal clouds drifting lazily. The silence felt heavier than usual. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something watching me, but there was nothing, just the cold air and the faint sound of the wind. I decided I'd keep watching until the research assignment ended. I had 2 more months to go. I couldn't leave early without a good reason. I wasn't in immediate danger, and there were no official reports of anything harmful happening. So I stuck to my routine, logging each cloud pattern I witnessed, checking my instruments, and trying to maintain some level of calm. But every time I looked at those clouds, I felt my skin crawl. My whole body tensed up, and I had to remind myself to breathe. It was like I was seeing another layer of reality, one that didn't want to be captured on film or explained with normal science. And yet it was there, repeating patterns and shapes with a deliberate precision. Now, I wait here every day, uncertain about what I'll see next. I live with a constant unease. My chest feels heavy, and my shoulders ache from the stress. I wonder if anyone out there believes me. I check the sky every morning, never knowing if I'll witness another impossible pattern. Each night I hear that hum, softly reminding me that something is trying to reach me. I'm not sure what it wants, I'm not sure I'll ever figure it out. But I'm here, alone, watching those clouds, feeling every hair on my neck stand up when they start to form those precise shapes again. And each time I feel like I'm getting pulled deeper into a place I can't describe. A place that goes beyond normal weather observations and maybe beyond my own understanding of what's real. I'm not used to talking about this. It feels strange, and I still get a tight feeling in my stomach whenever I remember the first time it happened. I found something in an old clock that changed my life. I'm a watchmaker, and I've spent most of my life surrounded by gears, springs, and tiny screws. I've always enjoyed the hum of a well-tuned mechanism, but then I uncovered a hidden device inside a large antique clock, and now I can't look at time the same way. I had just removed the main gear assembly to clean it, when I noticed a small metal plate at the back of the clock case. It looked like a panel I hadn't seen before. My heart started beating a bit faster. Because I wasn't expecting any secret compartments, I reached in with a thin screwdriver and pried the plate loose. Behind it, there was a tiny mechanism wrapped in a piece of cloth. I lifted it carefully and held it under the lamp. It was about the size of my palm. I saw gears, but they were arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense. There were a few switches I didn't recognize. I felt a sharp jolt of excitement. I'd never seen anything like that in my years of repairing clocks. I set it on my bench and stared at it for a while. I started examining each piece. A small winding key was on the side. I gave it a turn and it clicked a few times, then made a faint whirring sound. A tiny lever near the top caught my attention. I moved it, but nothing happened. Then I tried a second lever near the bottom. That's when things got weird. As soon as I moved that bottom lever, everything around me went silent. The hum of my desk lamps mopped. The faint ticking of clocks in the room stopped. The squeak of the swivel chair when I shifted my weight stopped. I looked around and realized that even the dust in the air seemed to be hanging in place. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears, and my throat felt dry. I stood up slowly, and my knees felt shaky. I reached for the lamp cord out of habit, trying to see if the lamp was off, but the light was still on. It wasn't flickering or anything. It just felt like I was stuck in a vacuum of stillness. I walked over to the door of my workshop. My steps sounded normal to me, but I didn't hear anything else. No cars from outside, no footsteps in the store. I touched the doorknob. It was cold. I opened the door. Everything out in the store was still. Nobody was behind the counter. A fly was frozen in midair near a trash can. My stomach tightened. I moved my hand slowly in front of the fly. It didn't react, didn't move at all. I felt a surge of panic. I returned to my bench, staring at the odd mechanism. That's when I felt a pressure in my chest, like I couldn't fully breathe, and my eyes started watering. I felt like I was going to pass out if I didn't move the lever back. So I did. I pushed it back to its original position. Suddenly I heard the hum of the lamp again, the distant sounds of traffic, and the fly continued its lazy path through the air. I sagged against the bench, my hands trembling. I didn't tell anyone about it. For the rest of the day I kept working on the grandfather clock, trying to act normal whenever a customer walked in. But my mind kept drifting back to that mechanism. I left it on the bench, hidden under a rag. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. That night, after the store closed, I locked the door and returned to the workshop. I wanted to test it again. I wound it up the same way as before and flipped that lower lever. The world froze in place. My light remained on, but the only sound I could hear was my heartbeat. I felt my pulse thumping in my ears. I took one step, then another. I felt like I was moving through some thick, invisible air. I pushed a pen off the edge of my desk and it hung there, barely moving. I touched it and it floated an inch or two before I let it go. Then I felt that same pressure in my chest. My vision blurred at the edges, and I fought to stay calm. I reached out and flicked the lever back again. Everything snapped back to normal. The pen clattered on the floor, and I gasped for breath. I realized there was a short limit to how long I could remain in that state. Over the next few days, I experimented a bit more. I found that I could stop time for maybe 30 seconds before I felt too weak to continue. If I extended past that, I got dizzy. I stayed in my workshop after hours and tested small actions. I'd freeze time, walk around the room, move a few objects, then switch it back. I never told my few friends or my regular customers. I couldn't think of a safe way to explain it. I worried they would call me crazy or try to take it from me. One evening I decided to walk into the street after I flipped the lever. It was late, maybe 8 or 9 at night. The sidewalks were empty, but there were still cars passing on the road. After I activated the mechanism, everything stopped. I walked around a parked car and looked at the driver inside. He was reaching for something, and the passenger seat was frozen in place. My heart pounded as I moved closer. I tapped on the window. No response. I backed away. The silence was crushing me. My breathing was shallow. I felt that tightness in my chest again. Then I thought I saw something move in the reflection of the car's side mirror. I jerked around, but I didn't see anything behind me. I felt a chill on my neck, but the air was still. I deactivated the device and stumbled back to the workshop. My lungs hurt, and I had sweat rolling down the sides of my face. After that, I tried to stop time a few more times in the following week. Each time I noticed something strange, a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. Sometimes it looked like a dark shape shifting across the floor. Other times, like a pale figure just behind a doorway. My hands would sweat, and my heart would bang in my chest. I started leaving my workshop lights on all night. I didn't want to see anything in the dark. One night, I stayed late again. I was determined to figure out if I was imagining these movements. I thought maybe the stress was messing with my head. I decided to set up a small camera on my bench. I hit record, then activated the mechanism, but the camera obviously froze along with everything else, so that was useless. While time was stopped, I walked into the back room. I kept my eyes moving, scanning corners and shadows. My legs felt stiff and my mouth was dry. I listened for any sounds, but there was only silence. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint scraping noise. It sounded like metal dragging on concrete. My scalp tingled and I spun around. Nothing. I walked quickly to the main store area. My chest felt like it was constricting. A few seconds later, I had to flip the lever back. The store went back to normal. I felt like my heart was about to burst out of my ribcage. I didn't give up. I tried shorter intervals, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I looked around each time, trying to catch a clear view of whatever was in there with me. One evening, while I had the mechanism activated, I caught the outline of a shape near the back door. It was tall but kind of blurry around the edges. It seemed to shift or ripple. My hands shook. I couldn't breathe right. My eyes started to burn. It moved and I froze in place, panicking. Then the pressure in my chest flared up and I had to end the time stop. When everything went back to normal, there was nothing there. But I felt a lingering cold in that corner of the room. My appetite disappeared for a while, and I lost a few pounds. I kept thinking about these shapes or figures lurking in the frozen moments. I wondered what they were doing there. They never spoke or touched me, but they left me feeling drained. One afternoon, I decided to test the mechanism outside again, hoping daylight would make me feel less scared. I waited until the street was somewhat busy. I picked a spot on the sidewalk where I wouldn't draw attention to myself. I activated the mechanism and took a step forward. Everyone around me was frozen, mid-stride, mid-conversation, mid-laugh. A breeze had been blowing through, and I saw a piece of paper stuck in mid-air, fluttering slowly. I turned to my left and saw a faint flicker above a mailbox. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a cluster of spidery limbs. I heard a raspy sound, a bit like a dry whisper. My hands felt cold, and I could feel my heart knocking against my ribs. I wanted to walk away, but my legs felt heavy. The shape shifted across the street, then vanished behind a car. I kept staring, but I lost sight of it. Then I felt the dizziness come on. I flipped the lever off and stumbled to a nearby wall, holding myself up until my balance came back. I started sleeping at odd times. I'd lie awake at night, imagining those shapes waiting for me in that frozen state. I kept the mechanism locked in a small safe. I tried to ignore it for a few days, but curiosity always pulled me back. Each time I hoped I might understand more, but instead I just kept seeing glimpses of those forms. Sometimes they looked like silhouettes of people. Other times they looked twisted with extra limbs or elongated torsos. I never saw them up close. They stayed distant or in my peripheral vision. I could never tell if they were watching me or just roaming around. I thought about getting rid of the device more than once. I even held it over a trash can, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it. I kept thinking about how incredible it was to pause time, even if it lasted only a few seconds. Despite the terror, there was a thrill in having that power. I tried to reason that maybe those things couldn't hurt me. They never touched me or chased me, but I felt sure that if they came too close, something bad would happen. The anxiety kept eating at me. One night, I worked on the old grandfather clock again, the same one I originally found the device in. I had it almost fully restored. While I was polishing the pendulum, I couldn't help glancing at the mechanism sitting on my bench. Eventually, I stopped working and walked over to it. I spun its winding key and flipped the lever. My workshop went silent. A second later, I heard a scraping sound from above. I looked up at the ceiling. It sounded like someone was dragging something across the rafters. My heart raced. I put one hand on the bench to steady myself. The scraping got louder. I looked around for a weapon, but all I had was a small hammer. I gripped it tight, Sweat trickled down my face. Then the scraping stopped. I waited, holding my breath. My chest started to ache. I flicked the lever off again and heard cars outside, the steady buzz of my lamp, and my own shaky breathing. I needed fresh air. I locked up, took the mechanism home, and tried to sleep. But I kept hearing noises in my dreams. In the morning, I decided to test one last theory. I drove to a quiet park near my place. There were trees, benches, and a small pond. I waited until nobody was close by. Then I flipped the lever while standing near the water. The surface of the pond turned still like glass, but my presence stirred up ripples that froze mid-motion. I looked around quickly, scanning for any shapes. I heard a light rustling from behind a tree. I tensed, gripping the device in my hand. A gray figure leaned out from behind the trunk. It had an elongated arm that reached toward a branch. I felt my stomach twist. My pulse hammered. I could almost see a face, but it was blurred, like fog over a mirror. I backed away, stepping carefully, not taking my eyes off it. It didn't move closer, it just stared, if that's the right word. My eyes burned and my breathing got rapid. I turned around, flipping the lever off as I did. The pond came back to life. The rustling of leaves returned, and there was nobody behind the tree. Now I'm back in my workshop telling you all this. I keep the mechanism in my safe, but I can't stop thinking about it. I'm exhausted. My hands shake whenever I open the safe. I don't know what those shapes are, and I'm not sure I want to find out. But part of me wants to push it further to see if I can communicate or at least understand. Another part of me wants to crush the device under a hammer and forget this ever happened. For now, I keep it locked away. I haven't touched it in a week. I still catch myself glancing at the shelves and corners of my workshop, half expecting to see something peeking back at me. My heart thuds in my chest whenever I think I see movement in a mirror or in the corners of the room. I don't know what happens in those moments when time stops, and I don't know how these creatures got in there or how long they've been there. I only know they watch me. Sometimes I feel sure they're waiting for me to come back. I don't know if I'll ever find the courage to flip that lever again. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But if I do, I'll be ready to turn it off fast. That's the only thing I'm certain of now, because the silence in that frozen world feels worse each time, and I don't want to push my luck. That's all I can share right now. I still feel uneasy, like something could appear in the corner of my vision at any second. So, I'm done talking about it. But you asked how it started. That's how. And that's why I don't look at clocks the same way anymore. I never thought an ordinary research trip could change the way I see the world. I was in a region known for old tribal artifacts, hoping to gather details for a paper on local customs. I had read about unusual practices, but I assumed they were just legends. Then I found the mask. It was hidden in a storage chest inside a dimly lit back room of a settlement I was visiting. It looked worn and unremarkable at first. The wood was rough. It had a few simple carvings around the edges. I noticed discoloration on the inside where someone's face had pressed against it. When I picked it up, my arms felt tense. I could smell a faint, earthy odor, like old leather and damp soil. I decided to take it back to my lodging for a closer examination. I'm anthropologist Daniel. I've traveled across remote regions for field work. I live for these trips, even though they get lonely. This trip started the same way. I reached the settlement, introduced myself to the elders, and explained that I was researching local traditions. They showed me baskets, tools, and small carvings, but didn't mention the mask. I found it by accident. The elders left me alone in a dusty storage area, while they fetched some items. The chest wasn't locked, it just sat there near a wall with cracked plaster. I opened it out of curiosity. Inside I saw cloth, small totems, and the mask. I felt drawn to it. I still don't know why I picked it up, but I did, and that changed everything. I returned to my small room, which was next to a communal kitchen area. My bag was on a simple cot, and there was a narrow table in the corner. The room smelled of stale cooking oil and old wood. I set the mask on the table, sat on the edge of the bed, and took out my notebook. I wrote a few lines about the mask's appearance. The designs around the edges were direct carvings of human figures. Each figure had big round eyes. The rest of the surface was uneven, as if the artisan had rushed the job or lacked proper tools. My heart beat a little faster while I studied it. It had a presence that kept my focus on it. Later that night, I decided to put the mask on. I felt silly. I'm not superstitious, but something about it made me want to try. The wood felt cold against my skin. I slipped it over my face, adjusting the strap behind my head. There was a mild pressure around my temples. I stayed like that for a few seconds, just breathing. At first, everything looked normal. My room was the same. Then I caught a flicker in the corner of my vision. It vanished. I thought I was tired. I took the mask off and rubbed my face. I left it on the table, turned off the light, and lay down. I couldn't sleep well. At around 3 in the morning, I heard something moving outside my window. A soft shuffle like dry leaves on concrete. I got up, turned on the overhead bulb, and checked outside. The night was quiet. I shrugged it off, but my chest felt tight. The next morning, I woke up with heavy eyes and a dull headache. After breakfast, I went to my table to take notes on the mask again. I slipped it on for a moment. This time, I tried to look around methodically. As I turned my head to look near the door, I saw a distortion in the air. It was like a ripple, but I'm hesitant to use any figurative language. It just looked like a transparent shape. My breath got stuck in my throat. I kept staring at that spot. The shape moved a little. Then it blinked out. I pulled the mask off. My pulse was racing. I took a minute to calm down. I wanted to check again, but a wave of apprehension swept over me. I decided to do some controlled tests. I waited until mid-afternoon when the sun was bright. I closed the curtains just enough to dim the room. Then, I put on the mask. I looked around slowly. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then I looked to my left.
There was a figure.
It was partially transparent. It stood at the foot of my bed facing me. It looked humanoid, but I couldn't see distinct features. I froze. My hand started to tremble. I noticed the hair on my arms rising. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The figure stayed there, not moving. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I reached for the mask strap to pull it off. But before I could remove it, the figure shifted its head. Then it turned to the side and vanished. I put the mask down on the table. I backed away, breathing hard, almost staggering. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, looking at the mask. My chest felt tight. My mouth was dry. I had never seen anything like that in my life. I was shocked, but I wanted answers. I tried to gather my courage. My mind was racing with questions. What are they? Why can't we see them without the mask? How many of them are around? I stayed like that for a long time, staring at the mask. That evening, I decided to put the mask in my bag and walk around the settlement. I needed fresh air. As I passed through the main dirt road, I saw a few residents going about their day. The sun was setting, the air felt heavy, and my shirt was sticking to my back. I wanted to see if these things appeared outside. I found a discreet spot near some small wooden houses. There was a narrow alleyway and a fence. I slipped the mask on again, taking quick glances. At first, I only saw the old fence. Then, I caught sight of 2 shapes near a cluster of empty crates. They were near each other. I felt my stomach tighten. My breathing got rapid. They were standing facing each other. Then they turned toward me. They didn't have faces I could recognize, but I sensed that they were looking straight at me. I struggled to keep calm. I wanted to know if they were aggressive. I took a step forward. The figures didn't move closer, but they seemed alert. My knees felt weak. My palms were sweaty. They were not just ignoring me, they could tell I was watching them. It felt like a direct confrontation. I looked away for a moment, but when I turned back, they were gone. I took off the mask, put it in my bag, and walked back to my room. For the next few days, I tried to figure out if I was hallucinating. I ran basic physical checks on myself. I took my temperature. I checked my pupils in the mirror. I wrote down every detail in my notebook. I also tried wearing the mask in different spots. I went to the communal kitchen, the storage room, and the porch outside. Each time I saw at least one of these beings. They were always near something else, like tables or corners, as if they used objects as cover. I noticed they didn't move through walls. They seemed to navigate the environment in a normal way, but they remained invisible to everyone else. Sometimes I saw them in pairs, other times just 1 or 2. Once I spotted 4 near a banana tree behind the settlement. My chest tightened every time. I never got used to it. I had trouble eating and sleeping. I was always on edge, worrying that if I wore the mask, I'd see them staring back at me. I tried to gather as many concrete facts as I could. They had no color, just a faint outline. Some were about my height, Some smaller, some taller. Their limbs were shaped like human arms and legs, but their torsos looked slightly narrow. I heard no sounds from them. My hearing never detected footsteps or breathing. I decided to keep the mask hidden. I was afraid someone would notice my disturbed behavior. I was also worried that these beings might not want to be observed, but curiosity kept driving me. One afternoon, I walked outside the settlement to a clearing near a dense patch of trees. I wanted to see if they would appear away from human presence. I found a rock formation that provided some shade. I put on the mask, scanning the tree line. After a few minutes, I spotted one being gliding between two thick trunks. It paused and turned its head in my direction. My scalp felt cold. I heard my heart beating in my ears. I forced myself to remain still, even though I felt like running. The figure vanished after a moment. As the days went by, I started to notice changes in my environment. Sometimes I saw subtle hints that these invisible beings were around, even without the mask. I'd see ripples in the air or feel a slight shift in the breeze when I stood in a quiet spot. I'd sense a presence behind me, then turn to see nothing. My skin would break out in goosebumps at odd times. Each time I checked with the mask, I'd find at least one watching me from a distance. They never spoke. They never touched me. But I felt their awareness. One night, I couldn't sleep again. I was lying in bed with the lamp on, staring at the mask on the table. I decided I needed to confront this situation directly. I got up, wore the mask, and turned my light down to a dim glow. I looked around the small room. It felt cramped. The temperature seemed high and I was sweating. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, in the corner near the door, a single figure stood. It seemed to be leaning forward. I felt a tingling in my fingers. My mouth went dry. I stayed still for a few seconds watching it. It took 2 steps toward me. I almost dropped the mask. My legs felt unsteady. I pushed the mask off my face. My breathing was rapid. I looked again without the mask, and nothing was there. I sat on the bed with the mask in my hands. I realized these beings were more than just passive observers. They knew I could see them. They were testing how close they could get. The idea of them standing a few feet away from me, invisible to my naked eyes, made me shiver. I wondered what they wanted. I decided I'd try one more approach. I removed my phone's camera from its case. I tried to record a video while wearing the mask, hoping I could catch some evidence. But my phone only showed an empty room. They didn't appear on the screen at all. It was frustrating. They existed physically, but not in a way our regular technology could capture. The tension built up. My nerves were raw. I'd wake up at night drenched in sweat, convinced something was hovering over me. Sometimes I felt a whisper of air move by my face, but I never saw anything without the mask. I started to wonder if wearing it too often was doing something to my mind. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. The elders seemed guarded whenever I asked about unusual artifacts. One day I casually mentioned a strange mask to one of them. His face went serious. He told me I should return it if I found something that wasn't meant for me. He refused to utter blood. Then he walked away. I decided to leave the settlement. I packed my bag and traveled to a nearby town with basic lodging. In my new room, I tried going a day without wearing the mask at all. I slept better, but then my curiosity returned. I put it on again the following evening. When I did, I found one of those beings standing in the corner near the ceiling. It was pressed against the walls, almost like it was attached there. My body tensed. I couldn't move for a few seconds. It seemed to be watching me. Then it slid downward and disappeared behind a chair. I took off my mask. I felt shaky. The fact that it followed me made my heart pound. On my final night in that region, I made a choice to store the mask away in a wooden crate with some other items and seal it. I thought it might stop them from appearing. But even after I sealed it, I felt the same sense of being watched. I suspect they had grown familiar with me. Maybe the mask's effect lingered. I'm not sure. That was enough for me. I decided to go home back to the city. I carried the sealed crate on the plane. I stayed awake through most of the flight, replaying everything that had happened in my head. I kept scanning my seat row, the aisle, and the overhead compartment. I never put the mask on during the flight. Still, my nerves remained on high alert. I reached my apartment in the city. It's a small place with a single bedroom and an open living area. I put the crate in my closet. I tried to get back to a normal routine, cooking, reading, checking emails. But the memory of those beings lingered. Some nights I swore I saw faint shapes in the corners of my vision. Once or twice I opened the closet, stared at the crate, and wondered if I should destroy the mask. I didn't do it. I don't know if that would do any good. I haven't worn the mask in a while. I still think about it. I know that if I put it on again, I'll see them, and they'll see me. They might be in my living room right now. They might be behind my couch or in my kitchen. I feel uneasy, but I'm also drawn to the possibility that I've discovered something massive about our world. I've considered contacting a colleague, but I don't want to be ridiculed or labeled as unstable, so I keep this a secret. Sometimes at night I press my ear against the closet door, listening for any sign of movement. I only hear my own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I don't know what these beings are, or why this mask reveals them. I only know that they're real, and they're aware. For now, I'm trying to live with that knowledge. There are moments when I want to open that crate, take out the mask, and put it on to confront them again. But then I remember the way my chest locked up the last time I saw one up close. I remember the way it stepped toward me. I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready to learn what they might do if I look at them for too long. So I keep the mask hidden, and I try to calm my nerves whenever I walk into a dark room. I try to remind myself that nothing has harmed me yet. But every so often I sense a shift in the air, and I find myself looking at corners for a shape I can see without that piece of carved wood. My life has changed. I know they're out there, whether I'm looking or not. And that knowledge stays with me every time I close my eyes. I can unsee what I've seen. I don't know if I'll ever find peace with that. I still feel my pulse going crazy when I think about the night everything changed. I'd been obsessed with my project for months, but I never expected any signal from an external source. I was sure my device would only record my own brainwaves, storing them for later analysis. When I first saw the irregular spikes on the screen, I thought it was a glitch. I reached for the sensor cables, checked the connections, and scanned for faulty wiring. Everything looked fine. That moment I felt a twisting in my stomach. My hands clenched around the edge of the table. I leaned in closer, eyes fixed on the monitor. Those flickers didn't look random, they had a pattern. I should have shut the device off and gone to bed, but something in me needed to know what was happening. I'm a neuroscientist by trade, with a focus on sleep research. My background is mostly in designing tools to map brain activity.
I've spent years working with EEG systems, and I like to believe I know my way around circuit boards and code.
That night, though, I felt like a rookie. My device, the Synwave collector, was built to capture the subtle shifts in neural patterns during different stages of sleep. I wanted to isolate dream-related signals for further study. The idea was to see if I could replay my own dreams on a monitor, or at least map them more accurately than a standard EEG. I had notebooks filled with diagrams and equations, and I'd tested preliminary versions on volunteers with no major results. Eventually I decided to try it on myself at home. Late at night, my apartment is cramped and smells like old paper and stale coffee. I keep my workspace in the living room, right in front of a small sofa. I had a folding table covered with printed circuit boards, a spare laptop, and various cables. The Synwave collector was resting on a rubber mat, ready for me to strap it on my head. It finished calibrating the software earlier that evening. The plan was simple. I'd lie down on the sofa, slip the device on, and let it record my brainwaves while I drifted off. I was excited about the possibility of seeing new data in the morning, but I was also anxious. I didn't know how comfortable it would be to sleep with that contraption around my forehead. I began by placing the contact sensors on specific spots around my scalp. Each sensor was padded with a bit of conductive gel. I double-checked my reference guides to ensure I put them in the right positions: temporal lobe, frontal lobe, occipital lobe, and so forth. The band around my head was snug, but not uncomfortable. I connected the cables to a small control box that fed signals to my laptop. My breath felt shallow as I settled onto the sofa. I gave the keyboard a quick command to start recording. Then I lay back, turned off the overhead light, and tried to relax. My mind usually races at bedtime, but that night I was so tired from tweaking the device that I fell asleep faster than I expected. At some point I stirred, my eyes half opened, and I realized the laptop screen was glowing brighter than before. I sat up, rubbing the side of my face. A faint prickling sensation ran along my scalp like static electricity. I noticed the data stream flickering across the monitor. My pulse hammered in my chest, and I felt a flush creeping across my cheeks. The logs weren't just capturing my normal dream state patterns. There was something else. It looked like a wave with periodic spikes that weren't aligning with the typical sleep stages I knew. I dragged myself off the sofa and stood in front of the desk. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my hands felt a bit shaky as I tapped at the keyboard. I checked the device's built-in filters to see if maybe I'd left something open to outside interference, like radio signals or electromagnetic waves from nearby equipment. I had designed the system to shield against that stuff, but I thought maybe I'd overlooked something. After rechecking the code, the filters and the hardware connections, I still had no explanation. Around 3 a.m., I decided to keep going. I was too wired to go back to sleep. I settled onto the sofa again, letting the device record my brainwaves for another hour. This time I felt a slight throbbing behind my eyes as I drifted off. I had a strange dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. In it, I was standing in an empty warehouse with harsh white lights overhead. I heard a distant humming noise like an engine. I looked around and felt my heart pounding. Then I heard a strange crackle, followed by a whisper I couldn't make out. I tried to focus, but I snapped awake with a gasp. I bolted upright and tore off the headset. My forehead was covered in sweat, and my t-shirt stuck to my back. My hands were cold, and my mouth felt dry. I looked at the screen again. The same spikes had shown up in the data, but they were stronger now. They aligned with the moments in my dream when I heard the crackle and the whisper. I played back the audio feed that the device had recorded. It was mostly white noise, but there were random bursts of something that sounded like faint static. I strained my ears, but I couldn't make out any words. I felt a jolt of excitement along with a stab of fear. It seemed like I was receiving something from an unknown source, and it was syncing with my sleep. The next morning I woke up with a stiff neck on the sofa. My laptop was still open. The logs looked messy, with hundreds of lines of data. My mind was foggy, but I remembered everything. I checked the time and realized I'd only slept about 4 hours. I brewed some black coffee, gulped it down, and decided to review the data more carefully. I wrote a quick script to isolate the strange signals from my normal brainwaves. Once separated, I saw that the signals had a pattern I'd never seen before. It looked like short bursts, then a pause, then another burst. They varied in intensity but not randomly. There was a repeating cycle, like someone tapping on a door. I felt my heart hammering as I stared at the screen. I kept thinking about how to verify this. I tested the device's sensors with the standard function generator, and everything worked fine. I tried to recreate the anomaly by playing random radio frequencies, but that didn't match what I'd captured. Nothing explained those patterns. It dawned on me that maybe these signals were coming from somewhere beyond normal equipment or local interference. By late afternoon, I was too hungry to think straight. I ordered takeout and paced around the living room. I kept glancing at the sofa, the spot where I'd been lying when the signals came through. I was tempted to try again. At the same time, I felt nervous about what might happen if I exposed my brain to that unknown pattern. But I couldn't walk away. I decided to do another test that night. This time, I planned to keep myself more alert. I set up a small camera pointed at me and added a real-time visual on the laptop so I could watch the waveforms if I woke up. I also placed a voice recorder next to the laptop speaker, hoping to capture any audible hints. That second night, I strapped on the device around 11 p.m. I stayed awake on the sofa for a while, scanning the waveforms. For the first hour, I saw only normal patterns. Alpha, beta, and a bit of theta as I got more tired. At around midnight, I began to drift off. I remember my eyes closing, my body relaxing, and my thoughts fading. The next thing I knew, I was in that warehouse again. The floor was concrete. The air smelled musty like old metal. The lights buzzed overhead and there was that steady hum. I felt my chest tighten. Then I heard that crackle, but it seemed louder. I stayed still, trying to figure out if I was dreaming or if something real was happening. I touched the side of my head and realized I still wore the device. A chill went down my back. Suddenly, I heard a thin, high-pitched beep, then a whisper. It was close to my ear. I tried to speak, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I took a step forward in the dream, and I heard my footsteps echo in the empty warehouse. I heard a faint voice muttering something like hello, but it was too distorted to be sure. Then I felt a surge in my temples, a pressure that made me flinch. I jerked my head to the left, and everything went dark. I woke up on the sofa, panting. My entire back was damp with sweat. My mouth tasted bitter, and my heart pounded so hard it felt in my ears. I looked at the laptop. The data stream was going nuts with the same repeating spikes, only stronger. The camera was still recording. I reached out with a trembling hand and stopped it. Then I checked the timestamp. Those signals had gone on for about 2 minutes in total, right around the time I was in that dream. I played back the audio. I heard rustling, probably me moving around, then a series of soft pops and clicks. At one point I definitely heard something that sounded like a faint voice. It sent a cold shiver up my arms. The next few days were a blur of testing and double-checking. I adjusted the software to remove any chance of local interference. I shielded every cable with extra foil and shut off every other device in the apartment, including my phone and rotor, to see if that changed anything. Nothing did. Each time I tested the synwave collector while sleeping, I got those bursts of signal, and each time I dreamed of that warehouse. Sometimes the detail shifted. Maybe the lights were dimmer, or the hum was louder, but the voice was always there, whispering. I began to dread going to sleep. I tried sleeping without the device for a couple of nights. I crashed in my bed instead of the sofa, thinking maybe distance from the workstation would help. The dreams disappeared, and the next day I felt more rested, but I also felt a strong curiosity pulling me back. I couldn't ignore this. Something was reaching out. Something was creating those spikes that matched my dream activity. I had no idea if it was alien or some other phenomenon I couldn't explain. All I knew was that the signals were real. My mind cycled between fear and a need to figure this out. On the 5th night, I decided to go all in. I set up a more thorough recording system, with multiple cameras and a microphone placed right at my mouth to capture anything I might say in my sleep. I also added a real-time translator software that would try to analyze any sound it picked up, in case the whispers were some scrambled speech. By midnight, I felt jumpy. My hands were clammy, and my neck felt stiff. I forced myself to sit on the sofa, strap on the sine wave collector, and press record. Falling asleep took longer this time because my mind wouldn't shut off. I kept thinking, what if something is trying to make contact? Am I letting it in? My pulse wouldn't slow down. Eventually exhaustion won. My eyelids got heavy, and I sank into darkness. The next thing I remember is standing in that warehouse again. The lights flickered. The hum droned like before, but now I noticed a strange flickering on the walls. It looked like a faint glow. I felt my skin prickling. My throat was tight, and I couldn't swallow. Then I heard the whisper, more distinct than ever. It sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around. I didn't see anyone, just the empty space and those flickering lights. I tried to speak in the dream. My voice came out shaky. "Can you hear me?" I said, or at least I tried to. I wasn't sure if anything came out. The whisper responded with a cluster of crackles and pops. Then I heard a word. I'm not sure if it was help or something else. My stomach twisted. I backed away from the spot where I thought the voice was coming from. My legs felt weak. The pressure in my temples returned. I felt dizzy. I collapsed to my knees, and the floor felt cold against my skin. Then everything went black, and I woke up on the sofa again. I inhaled so sharply that I choked on air. I coughed, gripping the sides of the sofa tightly. My eyes darted to the laptop screen. The signals were off the charts, spiking at intervals that matched the times I heard the voice. The translator software had recorded some odd phonetic strings that didn't match any known language, but it marked certain segments as possible word fragments. My hands shook as I read them on the screen. None made sense in English. Still, the presence of consistent patterns told me I wasn't imagining it. Over the following nights, I kept experimenting. I got a handful of new signals, and the dream repeated with slight variations. Each time, I felt the same mix of fascination and dread. My body showed physical signs of stress. I had tension headaches during the day, and I noticed small tremors in my hands and tight shoulders. I often caught myself pacing around the apartment, unable to focus on normal tasks. The only thing on my mind was that warehouse dream, and the signals. I couldn't focus on reading or working on other projects. Even small chores like washing dishes felt distracting, because I kept thinking about that voice. After a week of this, I decided to see if I could communicate back in a controlled way. I modified the synwave collector to send a small output signal that might piggyback onto my own brainwaves. It was a risky move, but I had to try. I reasoned that if this unknown source was reaching me somehow, maybe I could send something back. I programmed a short pattern that represented a basic binary code, hoping the device would merge it with my sleep signals. My heart raced just thinking about the idea. I felt sweat on my forehead and my mouth went dry. That night, I lay on the sofa again, with the new version of the device. The living room felt stuffy. I cracked open a window, letting in some cool air. Then I hit record. My pulse thumped as I eased into sleep. At first, I didn't dream of the warehouse. I saw random images, flashes of my apartment, half-formed shapes. Then it shifted. I was back in that space, standing on the cold floor. The hum was louder than ever. The lights flickered fast, making my eyes hurt. I sensed movement behind me. I turned around quickly, and I thought I saw a shape, like a tall figure. I couldn't see it clearly. I called out, "Who are you?" The shape flickered out of sight. Then I felt that pressure in my temples again. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My legs wobbled. The whisper got louder, but I still couldn't make out clear words. I tried to focus on the idea that I was sending a code. I concentrated on that binary pattern, hoping it would link with the signals. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The whisper changed in pitch, almost like it was responding. I staggered forward, reaching out with my hand. I felt empty air. Then the light started to blink erratically, and the hum rose in frequency. It felt like the entire place was vibrating. My teeth clenched, and a sharp pain shot through my head. I cried out. When I opened my eyes on the sofa, I gasped for air. My hands shook, and my chest felt tight. I scrambled to look at the data. My code had been sent at least once, but the system log showed a strange feedback loop. The unknown signal had fluctuated in a way that matched my outgoing pulses. Something recognized my attempt. I stared at the screen with a mix of excitement and fear. The translator software picked up more random phonetics, but no clear message. I looked at the time. It was almost 4. I felt exhausted, drained by whatever I had experienced. My neck and shoulders ached, and my mouth tasted like metal. I realized I was panting as if I'd just run a mile. I sat there, letting my breathing slow. I glanced around my apartment, half expecting something to pop out of the shadows. Nothing moved. The device sat on the table next to me, still plugged into the laptop. The only sounds were my own shaky exhales and the faint hum of the computer fan. I wiped sweat from my forehead and took a few minutes to calm down. Then I saved all the data and powered off the system. I didn't know what else to do. A chill ran through the air, so I shut the window and locked it. My heart was still hammering. I don't know what's trying to contact me or why it's using my dreams to do it. I keep wondering if I should continue or destroy the sine wave collector and walk away, but I can't. My mind is full of questions, and part of me wants to push further, see if I can decode the signals. Another part of me wants to sleep without seeing that warehouse, without feeling that awful pressure in my head. Either way, I know there's no going back to normal. I built a device to record my own brain waves, and instead I opened a door to something else. Just thinking about it creates tension in my stomach. Now, every night I sit in front of the couch and wonder if I should put that headset on again, or shut it all down for good. But so far, I haven't been able to stop. I woke up today with a tight feeling in my chest. My forehead felt damp, even though the room wasn't that warm. I had a strange sense that something was off. I walked across my small apartment, stepping over a scattered bundle of paintbrushes I forgot to put away last night. The hallway leading to my studio was dark, so I switched on the light with a shaky hand. When I pushed the studio door open, I noticed the sharp smell of paint in the air. At first, I thought I'd left some freshly used brushes soaking in solvent, but that wasn't the problem. My painting on the easel had changed. I stared at it. My eyes felt dry. I blinked a few times, hoping that would fix whatever confusion I was having, but nothing changed. The artwork on the canvas was not how I remembered it before I went to bed. I felt a tingle in my stomach. My throat felt like it was closing. I paint landscapes. I started about 10 years ago, mostly capturing calm seascapes in quiet forests. Last night I had been working on a painting of a meadow with bright green grass. The light in the sky was slightly golden, and I was adding some final details to the clouds. I remembered stopping around midnight. The painting looked peaceful at that time, but this morning it was different. The grass wasn't bright or welcoming. It was dark, closer to muddy brown. The sky had a heavy layer of gray, and there were streaks of black running from the clouds down to the tree line. That alone would have been enough to make me question my memory. But there was something else there, a shape in the background. It looked like a figure standing near the edge of the meadow, close to a cluster of trees. I couldn't make out a face, but it seemed to have a hunched posture, like it was leaning forward. The paint looked fresh in that spot, as if it had been applied just hours before. I didn't remember painting it. I didn't remember ever mixing those shades of dark color. I walked closer, leaning in to see the brush strokes. My heart pounded in my chest and I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead. I touched the surface with my fingertip. The paint was slightly tacky, not fully dry. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. Maybe I had painted it late at night, half asleep, but I didn't remember anything like that. I felt my legs shaking as I stepped back. I told myself I just needed to calm down. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe I had been trying something new and forgot about it. I decided to get some water and come back in a few minutes with a clear head. I forced myself to walk to the kitchen. My hands were unsteady as I poured water into a glass. I heard the quiet buzz of my fridge. I tried to focus on simple things like the cool feeling of the glass in my hand. I took a few sips, swallowing slowly, trying to relax my breathing. My brain kept flipping between thoughts. 1 second, I wondered if someone had broken into my apartment. The next, I wondered if I had developed a habit of painting in my sleep. I didn't have any signs of a break-in though. The windows were locked. The door was locked. Everything else looked normal. I set the glass down, took one more look around, then returned to my studio. The figure in the painting was still there. The meadow still looked grim and cold. I tried to dismiss my fear. I told myself to repaint that portion of the canvas and move on. I picked up a clean brush, squeezed some bright green paint onto my palette, and tried to cover the brownish grass with a fresh layer of color. But the paint didn't take the way I expected. It felt like the older layer was still wet underneath, and it was mixing into the new paint, creating a murky tint. After several attempts, I gave up. I stared at the shape in the distance, feeling uneasy. I decided to leave the painting alone for the day. I went on to do smaller sketches and watercolors in a separate part of the room, trying to calm my nerves. That night, I double-checked the locks on my windows and door. I also placed a small motion sensor light inside the studio. I aimed it at the easel, hoping it would turn on if anything moved. I told myself this was just precautionary. Maybe I'd catch myself sneaking in at night, half asleep. I ate a quick dinner and avoided looking at the painting too much. I felt tense, like I was waiting for something bad to happen. My shoulders were stiff, and my back ached from sitting awkwardly all day. I finally lay down on my bed, phone beside me, ready to check the time if I heard anything suspicious. I slept in a restless way. I woke up a few times, glancing around in the dark. The motion sensor light didn't seem to activate. In the morning, I walked to the studio with my heart already racing. When I opened the door, I smelled fresh paint again, this time even stronger. My eyes locked onto the canvas. The sky looked darker than before, like it was nearing a storm. The figure near the trees had shifted closer. It felt like it was maybe 5 or 6 steps nearer to the foreground. I noticed a faint outline of something else in the distance, but it was hard to make out. I felt chills on the back of my neck. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I looked at the motion sensor light. It was still in place, but it hadn't turned on. The battery indicator was solid green, with no sign of anyone walking in front of it. I touched the canvas again. The new paint felt damp and the texture was slightly sticky. I rubbed my thumb and index finger together, feeling that familiar consistency. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I checked every corner of my apartment, but everything was as I had left it. All the locks were secure, with no footprints, no scuff marks on the floor, and no sign of someone else. I turned on my phone's camera and took a few photos of the painting. Then I recorded a short video clip of myself describing what had happened so far so I could watch it later and make sure I wasn't imagining things. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Each morning, I found fresh changes to my paintings. One night it happened with a new piece I was working on. I had barely started a sketch of a mountain range under a sunrise. I went to bed with just the basic outline and a wash of light color in the sky. The next morning, the mountains looked like they were covered in dark shadows, and there was a shape perched on a cliff, looking down at the valley. It had that same posture, the figure in the meadow painting. My throat felt tight every time I realized these changes weren't just random scribbles. They were detailed. They had depth and intention behind them. It was as if someone with serious skill was doing it, but I was alone in my apartment. I started sleeping in my studio on a small couch against the wall, thinking I could catch the moment when the changes happened. I set up my phone on a tripod to record through the night. The first time I did that, I woke up a few times in the dark, sitting up to check the painting. It looked the same. I felt relief as I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the painting had changed again. The figure had moved. A second figure had appeared next to it, both of them facing the foreground. I watched the entire recording on my phone. It showed me sleeping. It showed me shifting around, sometimes standing up to look at the painting, but the painting itself never changed on camera. There was no sign of paintbrushes moving by themselves. No one else entered the frame. Yet, in the morning, the artwork was different. I couldn't explain it. By the fourth or fifth night, I stopped trying to record. I felt exhausted. I had dark circles under my eyes. My stomach churned whenever I stepped into the studio. I kept working on my normal pieces, but I was losing confidence. I didn't know what was going on. I tried inviting a friend over to see the changes, but he wasn't able to spend the night. During the day, nothing changed in real time. The paintings looked exactly as they did when I first woke up. My friend told me maybe I was under too much stress, that maybe I was doing this in some sort of dissociative state. I had no evidence to prove otherwise, but it didn't feel right. One evening, I decided to confront the painting directly. I sat in front of the easel with a lamp pointing at it. I held a brush in my hand, determined to remove the figures from the meadow painting. I began painting over them, layer by layer, using thick strokes of brown and green. I tried to match the original color of the trees, covering up the strange shapes that had appeared. My chest felt tight as I worked, and the smell of wet paint hung heavy in the air. After about an hour, I had almost erased every trace of those silhouettes. I wiped sweat from my forehead, stood back, and looked at my work. It still looked a bit messy, but at least the disturbing figures were gone. I felt a faint sense of relief. I dragged a folding chair into the studio and sat facing the painting, determined to stay awake all night. I popped open an energy drink and sipped it slowly. My back felt stiff against the hard chair, but I tried to ignore the discomfort. As the clock moved past midnight, I felt my eyelids drooping. The quiet of the apartment pressed on me. No traffic noises outside, no neighbors making sounds. I stretched my legs, tapped my foot on the floor, and kept blinking to stay alert. Around 2 a.m., I felt myself slipping. I dozed off. When I jerked awake, it was 3:17 a.m. According to my phone, my neck felt sore, and my back hurt from the awkward position. I looked at the painting. My chest tightened. The wet paint I had used to cover the figures was gone. The new paint looked dry, and the figures had reappeared, clearer than ever. This time they had faces. The expressions were blank, but their eyes were fixed forward. My skin felt cold. My arms trembled. I dropped the energy drink can, and it rolled across the floor. I stood up quickly, my heart hammering, and flicked the lamp switch a few times. The overhead light was on, so the room was bright enough, but nothing made sense. My mind was racing. I felt like I might throw up from the tension in my stomach. I forced myself to stare at the faces on the canvas. They looked back at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I saw shallow lines around their eyes, and the paint was layered in a way that gave them a stark presence. I touched the surface again. It was dry to the touch. It was like it had been finished hours ago. I backed away, stumbling over the chair. I swore out loud, grabbing the chair to keep my balance. My breathing was fast and ragged. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I paced around my apartment. I walked into my bedroom, opened my closet, and took out a blanket, then threw it over the painting. I couldn't look at it anymore. My mind kept returning to the question, how was this happening? I didn't have an answer. I felt exhausted, but I couldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those faces. I felt like they were watching me through the blanket. By the time morning rolled around, my eyes were burning from lack of sleep. I stepped into the kitchen to grab more water. My hands shook as I turned on the faucet. The water splashed against the sink, and I stared at the metal drain. I thought about leaving my apartment for a while, maybe going to stay at a friend's place, but I didn't want to abandon my work. Everything I owned was here, including all my painting supplies. Besides, I wasn't sure if the problem was connected to this place or to me. Maybe the paintings would keep changing no matter where I went. I paced back to the studio, pulled the blanket off the canvas, and stared at the faces again. They looked harsh in the morning light. I grabbed my phone and took pictures. Then I sent them to a friend just to have some kind of evidence. My heart pounded as I typed a message explaining what had happened overnight. I waited, phone in hand, but I got no immediate response. I checked the time. It was still early. I tried to distract myself by cleaning my brushes, wiping them with a rag, and letting the bristles soak for a bit. The sharp smell of solvent filled the room. I remembered the day before, when I had tried to paint over the figures. I had no proof that trying again would do anything differently, but I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let these things keep appearing without a fight. I popped open a new tube of paint, a pale gray color, and set to work, trying to wipe out every detail of those faces. I used thick strokes and coated the canvas until I was satisfied that nothing was visible underneath. Then I stepped back, breathing hard. My shirt stuck to my body from sweat, and my fingers felt cramped from holding the brush so tightly. I leaned the painting against the wall to let it dry. I told myself I wouldn't sleep in the same room with it again. I'd keep it under observation, but from a distance. That evening, I placed the painting face down on the floor just to see if that would help. I locked the studio door from the inside and then exited through another door that led to the hallway. I wanted to see if turning it away from view or restricting its position would stop the changes. I felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. I spent the night on my living room couch. The studio door locked behind me. I turned on some music, tried to watch a few videos on my phone, and forced myself to stay awake until about 2 a.m. My eyes were heavy when I finally gave in to sleep. My stomach was still knotted, and my arms felt like lead. In the morning, I approached the studio door with dread. I turned the key and pushed the door open. The first thing I saw was the painting, upright on the easel again. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had left it face down. Now it was back in its normal position, as if someone had lifted it during the night. I felt a rush of dizziness. I took a few slow steps forward. The painting was completely different. The sky was almost black. The meadow was a distorted scene of twisted trees, and the figures were at the center standing side by side. They both stared straight ahead, each face painted in a rough but unnerving way. Their eyes were large and dark. My mouth went dry. I tried speaking, but nothing came out. The paint smelled strong, like it had just been applied. I heard a quiet drip of liquid on the plastic sheet I keep under my easel. A tiny bead of paint slid down the canvas and fell to the floor. I stood there, my heart pounding, breathing hard. I could feel a faint trembling in my legs, as if they might give out. I didn't know what to do next. I had tried removing the paint, facing the painting away, and recording the room. None of it worked. These figures kept coming back. They felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to give in. My palms were sweaty, and my mouth tasted bitter. I realized I was clenching my teeth so hard that my jaw ached. Right now, I'm just standing here, looking at these twisted shapes, and those two figures with their unsettling eyes. And too afraid to touch the painting again. And too rattled to leave my studio. I can hear my heartbeat in my ears, and my chest feels tight. I don't know if I should destroy the canvas, or try something else. I'm stuck in this loop, and every time I close my eyes, I see those faces in my head.
They won't disappear. They won't fade.
I feel like I can't trust my own space anymore, and I'm not sure how to make it stop. All I know is that my paintings are no longer under my control, and every time I try to fight back, they come back darker and stranger than before. That's the situation I'm in right now, with no clear way out. My hands are shaking as I finish telling this, and I don't know what else to do, except watch and wait for whatever comes next.